The city of New York in the late 1980s had a rhythm all its own. The streets never truly slept, a faint hum of distant traffic, the occasional wail of a siren, and the muted chatter of late-night pedestrians created an endless, almost hypnotic soundtrack. Neon lights flickered against rain-slicked sidewalks, casting pools of color that danced along the cracks and puddles, painting the city in hues of electric blues and fiery reds. Amid this restless urban heartbeat, one name carried weight, fascination, and fear: John Gotti. Known to many as the Teflon Don, his life was a blend of calculated criminal enterprise, charisma, and a love of attention that would make him one of the most infamous figures in American organized crime history. Yet, despite the headlines, the arrests, and the rumors, there was a quieter, almost hypnotic intrigue to his story, the kind that could pull a listener in late at night, tracing every step of his rise and fall in a soft, measured tone that lingered long after the city itself had gone to sleep. John Gotti's reputation was born from contrasts. He was a man of the shadows who thrived in public view, a criminal whose very audacity seemed to shield him from the consequences that swallowed so many of his contemporaries. The Teflon Don moniker was not merely a nickname, it was a reflection of his seeming immunity to conviction, the almost surreal ability to walk out of courtrooms with charges dismissed and juries bewildered. Yet behind the charm, the slick suits, and the carefully coiffed hair, there was a network of danger, loyalty, and paranoia that defined every step he took. To understand Gotti, one had to look beyond the glimmering surface, beyond the sensationalized media portrayals, and into the quiet mechanisms of power, fear, and ambition that guided him. It was a world where trust was rare, where whispers in dimly lit backrooms could dictate life or death, and where every glance from a supposed ally carried the weight of potential betrayal. In those early days of his public notoriety, when the press first began to notice his presence, Gotti's demeanor was magnetic. There was a calm confidence in the way he carried himself, a relaxed posture that belied the intensity of the life he led. To the casual observer, he seemed almost untouchable, a man who moved through New York's underworld with ease, earning respect not through mere intimidation but through the careful cultivation of image and presence. Every gesture, every carefully timed smile or nod, was a silent assertion of control, a reminder that he operated by his own rules, even in a city that had seen its share of kings and kings in waiting. The streets themselves seemed to respond to him. Walking through Brooklyn, the neighborhoods of his youth echoed with memory and legend, the narrow avenues lined with brick buildings that had witnessed the struggles of countless families. Streetlights glimmered on damp sidewalks as if acknowledging the shadows that lingered there, shadows Gotti would come to master. The whispers of local shopkeepers, the cautious glances of pedestrians, even the distant hum of subway trains, all of it contributed to an environment where stories were born, exaggerated, and repeated. It was within this environment that Gotti learned to navigate power, to understand the subtle language of dominance and submission, of fear and loyalty, and of the precarious balance between them. To the public, Gotti represented a kind of mythic figure. Newspapers painted him as glamorous yet dangerous, a man who seemed to live outside the ordinary constraints of law and morality. Television crews followed his every move, capturing images of tailored suits, slick hair, and a confident smile that could disarm even the most cautious of onlookers. Yet for those who truly knew him, who moved in the same circles of influence and fear, Gotti was more than a headline or a public persona. He was a strategist, a man whose decisions carried immense consequences, whose ability to read people and manipulate circumstances was almost uncanny. He understood that power was not merely taken, it was performed, displayed, and reinforced through careful actions, even as the world watched. The story of John Gotti is also, in many ways, the story of New York itself during this era. The city was alive with contrasts, wealth and poverty, opportunity and desperation, beauty and danger. It was a metropolis where fortunes could be made and lost in the blink of an eye, where the line between legitimate business and organized crime often blurred, and where a man like Gotti could rise to prominence seemingly overnight. Yet within the glamorous surface, there was always tension. Every success carried risk, every alliance the potential for betrayal. Gotti's life, even at its most public, was defined by an intricate dance of perception and reality, of control and unpredictability. For listeners drifting into sleep, imagining this city and its complex rhythms provides a canvas upon which the drama of his life slowly unfolds, each detail adding texture to the portrait of a man who would become a legend. There was also a human fascination in the duality of Gotti's existence. He could be both charming and ruthless, both generous to his family and unyielding in business dealings. This duality made him unpredictable, a source of constant speculation for law enforcement and journalists alike. How did he balance these extremes? How did he maintain such composure amid constant threats, both from rivals and from those sworn to uphold the law? These questions linger, not as urgent alarms, but as quiet curiosities that invite listeners to imagine the man behind the headlines. Each narrative layer peels back a portion of his complex persona, revealing the interplay of ambition, strategy, and an almost theatrical love of attention. Even the nickname, Teflon Don, speaks to a story of paradox. It evokes an image of a man who could slip through every trap, evade every accusation, and emerge unscathed from circumstances that would have destroyed others. Yet it is also a story of vulnerability, for Teflon is only effective as long as the right conditions persist. Beneath the charisma and calculated risk-taking lay pressures, hidden dangers, and the ever-present possibility of downfall. The tension between invincibility and vulnerability creates a subtle suspense that carries the listener through the night, an invitation to follow every decision, every maneuver, and every encounter with both calm attention and quiet anticipation. The intrigue deepens when considering how Gotti's persona intersected with media culture. While many criminals preferred obscurity, he embraced attention. Each public appearance, each carefully photographed smile, was part of a broader strategy of psychological influence. He understood that perception could be as powerful as any weapon, and that the careful cultivation of myth could protect him in ways violence alone never could. To drift into sleep while imagining these scenarios is to enter a world where image and reality, power and vulnerability, intertwine in delicate balance, creating a story that is both thrilling and strangely comforting in its rhythm. Ultimately, the story begins here, in the hushed corners of Brooklyn, in the neon glow of Manhattan nights, and in the whispers of a city that both feared and revered him. John Gotti's life was not merely a series of crimes or trials, but a carefully choreographed performance, a slow and deliberate rise through the shadows, punctuated by moments of public display and private tension. It is a story that lulls the listener into contemplation, drawing them gently into the intricacies of power, loyalty, and ambition. The city sleeps, but its stories linger, and in the quiet, one can trace the path of a man who captivated a nation, the Teflon Don whose shadow stretched across streets and headlines alike. And as the mind drifts along these streets and shadows, it becomes possible to understand, ever so softly, the life of John Gotti, not as a distant legend, but as a narrative landscape, rich with tension, detail, and the subtle beauty of human complexity. John Gotti's story begins not in the glittering headlines of Manhattan tabloids, nor in the courtrooms that would later define his notoriety, but on the crowded, weathered streets of East New York, Brooklyn. It was a neighborhood alive with the quiet rhythm of everyday struggle, where tenement buildings lined the avenues like sentinels of history, their brick facades streaked with soot and the marks of time. The air carried the mingling scents of fresh bread from corner bakeries, roasted coffee, and the faint tang of the nearby harbor, a reminder of both opportunity and the grit that shaped the lives of those who called this place home. To walk these streets was to feel the pulse of ambition and survival intertwined, a world that was at once confining and formative, and it was within this environment that Gotti's early life unfolded. From a young age, John's days were filled with both the mundane and the extraordinary. Childhood in Brooklyn in the 1940s and 50s carried its own particular rhythm. The sound of children playing stickball in narrow streets, the laughter echoing between buildings, and the occasional scolding of mothers from apartment windows created a tapestry of ordinary life. But beneath this familiar chorus, there was an undercurrent of hardship. Families juggled scarce resources, fathers labored long hours in factories or docks, and mothers managed households with an unwavering, sometimes weary, determination. For John, the contrast between the dreams he nurtured and the reality surrounding him was ever present. The streets taught lessons as much as the home, about toughness, about respect, and about the often invisible lines that separated safety from danger. It was a place where observing carefully could mean the difference between being overlooked or becoming prey to those with more ambition or ruthlessness. Gotti's parents, John and Filomena, were hardworking, determined to give their children stability despite the city's challenges. They hoped to instill in their children values of loyalty and perseverance, unaware that the very streets they navigated would eventually shape John in ways they could not fully anticipate. In those early years, Gotti witnessed both affection and tension within his family, the moments of warmth and the moments of strict discipline mingling to form a foundation upon which his character would develop. Even small incidents, a quarrel over spilled milk, a shared smile during a rare moment of calm, the sound of a parent returning home late from laborious work, contributed to a growing sense of observation and calculation that would later define his life. The neighborhoods themselves were alive with stories of survival and ambition. Local shopkeepers and neighbors had learned to read faces and behavior with precision, understanding quickly who could be trusted and who could not. It was in these streets that Gotti first learned the importance of reading people, of detecting subtle cues and shifts in attitude that signaled opportunity or danger. He absorbed the unspoken rules of interaction, the way a nod could convey agreement, the significance of a glance, the silent assertion of dominance among those who sought to rise above the rest. Brooklyn, with all its sounds, smells, and textures, became a kind of classroom where the lessons were both subtle and powerful, shaping a boy who would later navigate far more dangerous and complex arenas with similar acumen. School brought its own set of lessons, though not all of them academic. Gotti was a bright boy with a natural charm that could disarm teachers, classmates, and strangers alike. Yet, in a city where toughness was often valued over obedience, he learned quickly that intellect alone was not enough. Street smarts, timing, and a keen understanding of human behavior were equally crucial. He observed older boys, watching how they negotiated respect, how they handled confrontations, and how even small victories or defeats could ripple through the social fabric of the neighborhood. These early observations laid the groundwork for the strategic thinking that would define him in later years, a pattern of careful calculation that seemed almost innate, quietly developing amid the ordinary chaos of Brooklyn life. The pull of the streets was strong, and as adolescence approached, the allure of independence and power became increasingly tangible. Even in those early years, Gotti exhibited a fascination with influence, with the subtle ways in which one could command respect or create an aura of authority. Simple acts, convincing a peer to follow a plan, negotiating for small gains, or asserting control in a playground dispute, were lessons in leadership and risk-taking. These formative experiences, though seemingly minor at the time, were building blocks for a life that would eventually command attention on a much larger, far more dangerous stage. Gotti's early encounters with crime were, by many standards, almost inevitable given his environment. Petty thefts, small-time burglaries, and minor scuffles were common rites of passage for boys in neighborhoods where opportunity and temptation existed side by side. Yet even in these early transgressions, there was a hint of something beyond mere rebellion. Gotti exhibited a blend of cunning and composure that distinguished him from others who simply acted on impulse. He learned the importance of timing, of choosing moments carefully, and of understanding consequences. The streets demanded both courage and prudence, and in navigating this delicate balance, he began cultivating the skills that would later make him a figure both feared and admired. Friendships and alliances formed early, often dictated by shared interests and mutual protection. The bonds he created in adolescence would echo later in life, providing both opportunities and occasional dangers. Loyalty was a currency in these formative relationships, and Gotti quickly learned that trust, while invaluable, was always fragile. Observing the ebb and flow of these connections, understanding when to give deference, and recognizing subtle shifts in allegiance, all contributed to a nuanced understanding of human behavior that would serve him well in the treacherous world of organized crime. Even play had its lessons. Neighborhood games, street competitions, and informal contests of skill or strength were not merely pastimes, they were microcosms of the broader world he would later inhabit. The strategies developed in these moments, whether negotiating alliances or asserting dominance, were rehearsals for more consequential decisions in the future. Brooklyn itself, with its narrow streets, crowded corners, and textured social networks, became both stage and teacher, shaping Gotti's understanding of influence, strategy, and perception long before he formally entered the world of organized crime. Family, too, remained a guiding influence, a source of grounding amid the turbulence of street life. Moments of domestic warmth, shared meals, celebrations, and quiet conversations, provided both contrast and motivation. They reminded him of what was at stake, of the responsibilities that accompanied ambition, and of the human connections that even the most hardened individuals must navigate. This delicate interplay between loyalty to family, the demands of the streets, and the pull of ambition created a complex psychological landscape, one that would define many of Gotti's later choices. By the time John Gotti reached his late teens, the contours of his character were already well formed. He had absorbed lessons from every corner of his environment, the streets, the school, the home, and the community. He understood the power of perception, the subtleties of influence, and the consequences of action. Brooklyn had been both playground and training ground, shaping a young man whose ambition, charm, and audacity would later elevate him to a level of infamy that few could rival. Even in these early years, the tension between the ordinary and the extraordinary, the mundane and the dangerous, created a compelling narrative, one that invites listeners to drift slowly through each detail, observing the interplay of environment, choice, and character as if watching a city unfold under the soft glow of twilight. As John Gotti moved from boyhood into his teenage years, the streets of Brooklyn became more than just a backdrop to his life, they became a testing ground for his growing ambitions, a place where every encounter, every choice, carried weight and consequence. The city was alive with motion and sound, from the clatter of subway cars rumbling underground to the distant horns of trucks making their way through the narrow avenues. Nightfall brought a different rhythm, quieter yet charged with tension, as streetlights flickered against graffiti-stained walls and shadows stretched long across sidewalks. It was in these spaces, both public and hidden, that Gotti began his first real brushes with crime, small steps that would eventually form the foundation of a far more notorious career. Teenage rebellion is a common narrative, but for Gotti, it was intertwined with a developing sense of strategy and observation. While many of his peers sought thrills impulsively, he approached each situation with a quiet calculation, weighing risks and potential rewards. Petty thefts, small burglaries, and street scuffles were not mere acts of defiance, they were opportunities to test his own cunning and resilience. He quickly learned that minor victories in these arenas carried disproportionate influence. A carefully executed theft could earn him respect among peers, while a poorly considered confrontation could bring lasting consequences. In this way, the line between youthful mischief and deliberate ambition began to blur. The early criminal activities also served as a kind of apprenticeship, teaching him lessons in timing, discretion, and human psychology. He learned to read people with an almost instinctual precision, understanding when someone was bluffing, when an ally could be trusted, and when retreat was the wiser choice. These formative experiences fostered a quiet confidence, a sense that he could navigate even the most precarious situations without faltering. Observers may have seen only a teenage boy causing minor disturbances, but beneath the surface, he was rehearsing the skills that would later allow him to command a criminal empire with remarkable efficiency. Gotti's charisma began to manifest strongly during these years, setting him apart from peers. He possessed a natural charm, a way of speaking and gesturing that drew attention without seeming forced. People responded to his confidence, and in turn, he learned to leverage that attention to his advantage. Small alliances formed quickly around him, and even those initially wary of his intentions found themselves drawn into his orbit. These early networks, built on a combination of respect, fear, and loyalty, were delicate yet instructive. They demonstrated the power of influence and foreshadowed the intricate web of connections that would later define his rise through the Gambino family. The environment of Brooklyn itself played a significant role in shaping Gotti's approach to crime and social dynamics. Streets and alleyways were classrooms of a kind, offering lessons in observation, negotiation, and survival. The city's energy, sometimes harsh and unforgiving, demanded that young men like him learn quickly. One misstep could result in humiliation or worse, while a well-timed action could elevate one's status almost overnight. Gotti absorbed these lessons not through formal instruction, but through attentive observation, participation, and reflection. Even casual interactions, a conversation with a store clerk, a confrontation with a rival, a negotiation with friends, carried subtle cues about human behavior, loyalty, and risk. Over time, he developed a sense of foresight, an ability to anticipate reactions and outcomes that would later serve him in far more consequential arenas. Family continued to provide both grounding and contrast during this period. While Gotti was drawn increasingly into the world of petty crime, his home life offered a quieter, stabilizing influence. Observing the dedication of his parents, the routines of daily life, and the bonds among siblings, he gained an understanding of responsibility, consequence, and the subtle art of negotiation within intimate spaces. These lessons, though quieter than those of the streets, were no less significant. They fostered a sense of identity and self-awareness, even as he straddled the line between legality and criminality. The interplay of familial loyalty and streetwise cunning created a duality within him, a balance that would become central to his ability to navigate more dangerous and complex situations in adulthood. Gotti's first real encounters with law enforcement were both alarming and instructive. Arrests for minor thefts and fights introduced him to the structures of authority, the consequences of defiance, and the limitations of personal influence. Each encounter was a lesson in risk management, understanding which behaviors attracted attention, which could be concealed, and how to negotiate outcomes with minimal exposure. He began to grasp the importance of discretion, of appearing compliant when necessary, and of leveraging relationships to minimize personal liability. These experiences were formative, teaching him that intelligence and charm could be as valuable as physical courage when navigating environments governed by rules, both legal and illicit. Alongside these lessons came a growing awareness of opportunity and ambition. Gotti began to observe the adults around him, noting patterns of influence and power. Older gangsters, local hustlers, and even figures of authority demonstrated ways in which risk could be leveraged for reward. He studied their successes and failures with a keen eye, learning to discern which behaviors led to respect and which led to ruin. The streets of Brooklyn, already familiar, became a microcosm of larger networks of influence, a world in miniature where decisions, timing, and perception dictated outcomes. This observation honed his strategic mind, preparing him for the more sophisticated maneuvering he would later encounter within organized crime. Social dynamics also played a crucial role during this stage of his life. Friendships were both alliances and tests of loyalty, disagreements could escalate quickly, and subtle negotiations determined who held power in any given situation. Gotti's natural ability to read people allowed him to navigate these complexities with remarkable skill. He understood that dominance was often as much about perception as it was about action. By cultivating an air of confidence, carefully choosing moments to assert authority, and maintaining a calm composure in tense situations, he learned to influence outcomes without resorting immediately to force. These patterns of behavior, developed quietly and often unnoticed, laid the groundwork for the public persona he would later adopt, the calm, charismatic, and seemingly untouchable Teflon Don. Education outside the home took on a practical significance as well. While Gotti's academic achievements were modest, his observations of human behavior, negotiation, and strategy were a form of informal education that proved invaluable. Street knowledge, social acuity, and an understanding of human nature became the foundation upon which he would build his criminal career. Every minor scuffle, every successful theft, every negotiated agreement served as a lesson, reinforcing his understanding of consequence, influence, and control. These experiences, repeated and refined over time, cultivated a mindset attuned to both opportunity and risk, preparing him for the far more complex challenges that awaited. By the end of his teenage years, Gotti had begun to develop a clear sense of identity and purpose, albeit one intertwined with crime. The streets of Brooklyn had been his tutor, his challenges his instructors, and his victories small but meaningful markers of progress. He had learned to balance charm and cunning, observation and action, loyalty and calculation. Each minor success reinforced the notion that intelligence, timing, and social influence could achieve results that brute force alone could not. The pattern was emerging, a blend of audacity and careful strategy, a talent for reading people, and an instinct for survival that would define much of his life in the years to come. Even as his reputation began to stir among peers, Gotti remained attentive to the broader context of his environment. He observed the ambitions and downfalls of others, noting the consequences of poor decisions, betrayal, and misjudgment. By the time John Gotti was approaching adulthood, the world of petty theft and neighborhood scuffles had become too small for his ambitions. The streets of Brooklyn, which had once served as a proving ground, now pointed toward broader horizons, opportunities that promised influence, wealth, and power far beyond the narrow alleys of his youth. It was during this critical period that he first came under the tutelage of individuals already entrenched in organized crime, men who recognized in him a rare combination of charisma, cunning, and an instinct for leadership. These mentors, often operating in the shadows of New York's underworld, became guides in a world governed by unspoken rules, whispered allegiances, and the delicate balance between respect and fear. The first meetings were never formal or public. They happened in quiet backrooms, dimly lit diners, or the basements of familiar buildings where ordinary citizens passed by unaware of the clandestine negotiations taking place above or below them. Smoke hung in the air, mingling with the aroma of coffee, bread, and sometimes the faint tang of alcohol, creating a sensory backdrop that was at once ordinary and charged with significance. In these moments, Gotti learned to navigate an environment where every word, gesture, and glance carried meaning. He observed carefully, noting patterns of behavior and strategy among seasoned operators, absorbing lessons that could not be taught in any classroom or school. Mentorship in the underworld was not about guidance in the traditional sense, it was a rigorous, often unforgiving education. Gotti was exposed to the rules of loyalty, the necessity of discretion, and the subtle art of negotiation. He learned that power was maintained not through brute force alone but through careful alliances, strategic timing, and an understanding of human behavior. Each task assigned by his mentors, whether a simple courier job, a minor collection, or an observation role in a more significant operation, was both a test and a lesson. Success brought approval and access to more complex operations, while failure served as a warning, a demonstration of the stakes involved in every decision within the criminal hierarchy. One of the earliest lessons Gotti absorbed was the importance of reputation. In the underworld, perception often held as much weight as action. A man known for reliability, courage, and strategic thinking could influence events far beyond his immediate reach. Conversely, a lapse in judgment, a display of rashness, or a breach of trust could have swift and unforgiving consequences. Gotti, with his natural charisma and keen observational skills, understood this intuitively. He began to cultivate a persona that balanced approachability with authority, demonstrating competence while maintaining an aura of mystery and unpredictability. This careful calibration would become a defining feature of his leadership style in the years to come. Interactions with his mentors also provided insight into the organizational structure and operational methods of the mafia. Gotti witnessed firsthand the mechanisms through which decisions were made, disputes resolved, and authority maintained. He observed the delicate interplay of respect, fear, and loyalty that governed each interaction. These experiences reinforced the understanding that leadership required more than personal courage or ambition. It required emotional intelligence, patience, and the ability to anticipate the moves of others. For a young man still transitioning from adolescence to adulthood, these lessons were both profound and formative, shaping a mindset that would serve him well in the complex and perilous world of organized crime. The mentors also exposed Gotti to the strategic use of information and observation. He learned that every conversation, every transaction, every casual glance could carry meaning. The world of the mafia thrived on intelligence, knowing when to act, whom to trust, and when to remain invisible. Gotti's natural attentiveness made him particularly adept at interpreting subtle cues, understanding intentions, and predicting outcomes. These skills, refined under the guidance of seasoned operators, would later become hallmarks of his approach to both criminal enterprise and public image. The ability to read a room, to sense tension before it erupted, and to manipulate perceptions became as valuable as any tangible asset he acquired. While mentorship was a critical component of Gotti's early development, it was equally a test of his temperament and judgment. Loyalty was paramount, and trust had to be earned through action, not words. Each assignment, no matter how minor it seemed, required precision, discretion, and reliability. Failure was rarely tolerated, and missteps were often remembered far longer than successes. Gotti's ability to navigate these challenges demonstrated a combination of courage, intelligence, and adaptability. His mentors began to recognize that he possessed not only the potential for operational skill but also the leadership qualities necessary to ascend the ranks of the organization. This recognition marked the beginning of his transformation from a streetwise youth into a figure capable of commanding loyalty and respect on a far larger scale. The social lessons were equally significant. Gotti observed the nuances of influence, the subtle negotiations that occurred in casual conversation, and the ways in which alliances could be both strengthened and tested. He understood that power was as much about perception and reputation as it was about action. A well-timed demonstration of competence could secure loyalty, while misjudgment or impatience could erode credibility. These lessons extended beyond the practicalities of crime. They touched upon psychology, human nature, and the art of subtle manipulation. By internalizing these lessons, Gotti was effectively preparing himself for the multifaceted challenges of leadership within a complex and often ruthless organization. Mentorship also exposed him to the darker realities of the underworld. Violence, betrayal, and the consequences of disloyalty were constant reminders of the stakes involved. He witnessed disputes that escalated silently, observed the quiet resolution of conflicts, and learned that discretion could be more effective than confrontation. Each experience reinforced the importance of strategic thinking, patience, and the careful calibration of action and restraint. For Gotti, these lessons were not abstract, they were immediate, tangible, and consequential, shaping his approach to both professional and personal interactions for years to come. In addition to operational and social training, Gotti's mentors provided lessons in self-presentation and image management. He learned the subtle ways in which appearance, demeanor, and confidence could influence perception. Observing how seasoned operators carried themselves, he noted that power often depended as much on perception as on action. The cultivation of style, presence, and poise became intertwined with his emerging leadership identity. Even at a young age, Gotti began to appreciate that charisma and image could serve as protective tools, enhancing influence and sometimes even providing a layer of insulation from the consequences of risk-laden decisions. The cumulative effect of this mentorship was transformative. Even as John Gotti's influence and reputation within the Gambino family grew, there remained a side of him that was profoundly human, shaped by family, love, and a desire for connection. While the streets of Brooklyn, the backrooms of mafia operations, and the calculated risks of criminal enterprise defined much of his public persona, his private life offered a quieter, yet equally compelling, dimension to his story. This side of Gotti revealed the duality that would characterize his life, a man capable of both immense charm and ruthless decisiveness, both tenderness and violence. It was within this intersection of public ambition and private devotion that some of the most revealing and relatable aspects of his character emerged. Gotti's marriage to Victoria DiGiorgio in 1962 marked the beginning of a lifelong partnership that provided a grounding presence amid the chaos of his expanding criminal career. Victoria, with her steadfast personality and intuitive understanding of her husband's ambitions, became both confidant and stabilizing force. In a world dominated by secrecy, danger, and the constant need for strategic calculation, their relationship offered a sanctuary, a space where Gotti could navigate the complexities of everyday life without the constant pressure of surveillance, suspicion, and negotiation. The quiet domestic routines they shared, preparing meals, celebrating birthdays, attending school functions for their children, stood in striking contrast to the tension-filled decisions and operations that occupied his professional world. The home life that Gotti built with Victoria was suffused with moments of ordinary tenderness, providing a counterbalance to the extraordinary circumstances of his public life. He was a father who cherished his children, attending to their needs, sharing in their milestones, and taking pride in their accomplishments. The laughter of children echoing through the apartment, the aroma of dinner cooking in the kitchen, and the shared stories at bedtime created a rhythm of normalcy that grounded him in ways that the streets and criminal enterprise could not. For listeners, these moments offer a window into a man whose life was not solely defined by crime, but by love, responsibility, and the pursuit of connection in a world that often demanded emotional detachment. Gotti's ability to compartmentalize was remarkable. He could move seamlessly between the high-stakes world of organized crime and the intimate environment of his home, maintaining a sense of composure and focus in both spheres. Within the family setting, he demonstrated patience, attentiveness, and care, qualities that contrasted sharply with the assertive and sometimes intimidating persona he projected publicly. This duality did not indicate weakness but rather a nuanced understanding of human behavior. He recognized that different environments demanded different approaches, and he adapted accordingly. The home was a domain in which he could exercise vulnerability, warmth, and connection without compromising the authority and perception that defined him elsewhere. The dynamics within Gotti's family also offered lessons in loyalty and influence. Just as he cultivated allegiance among associates within the Gambino family, he nurtured trust and respect within his household. Victoria's influence, though quiet and subtle, helped shape his decisions, providing perspective and counsel that complemented his own instincts. The family became a microcosm in which the principles of observation, negotiation, and influence were practiced in gentler forms, reinforcing the skills that would later serve him in more perilous contexts. This interplay between domestic life and criminal enterprise illustrates the layered complexity of his character, offering a more complete understanding of the man behind the headlines. The contrast between Gotti's public notoriety and private devotion was also reflected in his approach to social interactions outside the home. In public, he cultivated a persona that combined confidence, charisma, and strategic unpredictability. In private, he demonstrated loyalty, attentiveness, and a genuine desire to maintain connections with those closest to him. This duality enhanced his effectiveness as a leader, allowing him to manage both perception and relationships with finesse. He understood that power was not solely a product of action but also of the impressions he left on others, whether in the courtroom, on the streets, or at the dinner table. The children, in particular, became central to Gotti's private world, offering both joy and a sense of responsibility. He took pride in their accomplishments, attended school events, and shared in the minutiae of their daily lives. These interactions, while seemingly ordinary, were deeply significant, reinforcing a sense of purpose beyond ambition and criminal enterprise. The home became a space where he could model loyalty, discipline, and care, demonstrating values that extended beyond the immediate pursuit of power. For listeners, these details create a sense of intimacy, illustrating the ways in which Gotti balanced personal devotion with the demands of a high-stakes, high-risk career. Even in moments of tension within the family, Gotti demonstrated an ability to negotiate, persuade, and maintain cohesion. Disagreements were resolved with a combination of firmness and understanding, reflecting the same skills that he applied in professional contexts. This adaptability allowed him to maintain authority without alienating those closest to him, creating a stable and nurturing environment despite the constant pressures of his criminal life. The lessons learned within these domestic interactions, about trust, influence, and emotional intelligence, were deeply intertwined with his broader understanding of leadership and power. Yet the duality of Gotti's existence was never more apparent than when juxtaposing domestic warmth with the dangerous realities of his professional life. While he could be tender and protective at home, he was simultaneously navigating a world in which loyalty was fragile, betrayal was common, and violence was a constant undercurrent. The contrast between these spheres highlights the psychological complexity of his character, revealing a man who could reconcile extremes without losing coherence or control. It is this interplay that makes his story compelling in a reflective, immersive way, allowing listeners to drift through his experiences with a sense of calm curiosity, appreciating both the ordinary and extraordinary elements of his life. Social gatherings and personal rituals within the family also played a role in reinforcing Gotti's identity. Celebrations, shared meals, and moments of reflection provided structure and meaning, creating a rhythm that counterbalanced the unpredictability of his professional world. These rituals reinforced bonds, nurtured trust, and allowed him to exercise influence in subtle, personal ways. They also offered moments of respite, times when the pressures of the streets and criminal operations could be temporarily set aside, replaced by laughter, conversation, and the quiet affirmation of familial connection. Even as the demands of his criminal career intensified, Gotti maintained this dedication to family life. The balance was not always perfect, and moments of tension inevitably arose, yet the deliberate effort to preserve these connections underscores the complexity of his character. It demonstrates an understanding that leadership and influence extend beyond public operations into the intimate, everyday interactions that shape human relationships. The ability to navigate both realms effectively speaks to the adaptability, intelligence, and emotional awareness that defined him, creating a nuanced portrait of a man capable of both ruthless ambition and genuine care. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that Gotti's domestic life was far more than a background detail. It was an integral part of the story that shaped his personality, informed his decisions, and provided a sanctuary amid the turbulence of his public existence. The interplay of love, loyalty, and everyday responsibility within the family offered lessons in negotiation, influence, and emotional intelligence that complemented the strategic and operational skills honed in his professional life. For listeners, these insights provide a sense of depth and intimacy, illustrating the human dimensions of a figure often reduced to myth or sensationalism. In the quiet spaces of home, the gentle rhythm of family life, and the tender interactions with his children and Victoria, one glimpses the layers of character that would define John Gotti, both the man and the legend. As John Gotti's influence within the Gambino family solidified, the world around him grew increasingly complex and fraught with tension. Power within organized crime is never absolute, and every ascent brings with it the inevitable reality of rivals, betrayals, and competing ambitions. Even as Gotti cultivated loyalty among his closest allies, he had to navigate a landscape in which friends could become adversaries and a single miscalculation could have deadly consequences. Brooklyn, the streets of his youth, had taught him early lessons in observation, strategy, and risk, but the dynamics within the mafia demanded a level of vigilance and calculation far beyond what he had encountered before. In these years, the quiet, almost hypnotic patterns of loyalty and betrayal began to shape the narrative of his rise, laying the groundwork for both triumph and eventual downfall. Rivalries within the Gambino family were subtle, often hidden behind layers of politeness, feigned respect, and strategic maneuvering. Disputes rarely erupted openly, rather, they simmered in whispers, gestures, and clandestine conversations. Gotti learned quickly to read these cues, to detect the smallest shifts in behavior or tone that might indicate discontent, ambition, or deception. He understood that alliances were fragile, that power was both a resource and a target, and that one's ability to anticipate challenges often determined survival. Each interaction, each negotiation, was an exercise in careful calibration, requiring patience, perception, and a strategic mind capable of navigating complex social hierarchies. Betrayal, in particular, was a constant undercurrent. Even the most trusted associates could be swayed by opportunity, fear, or resentment. Gotti's early experiences had taught him to measure trust carefully, to reward loyalty but also to remain vigilant. He observed the actions and words of those around him with acute attention, interpreting subtle gestures as indicators of potential risk or allegiance. In the world of organized crime, betrayal could be literal or symbolic. A delayed payment, a whispered rumor, or an alliance with a rival could have consequences as serious as any physical confrontation. Gotti's skill lay in his ability to discern these patterns and respond preemptively, reinforcing his authority while minimizing the risk of exposure. The most dangerous rivalries often arose not from external threats but from within the family itself. Ambition and resentment created a landscape in which alliances were tested, loyalties questioned, and power constantly negotiated. Gotti observed these dynamics with the precision of a strategist, recognizing that influence was maintained not only through action but also through perception. A well-timed demonstration of competence, a carefully chosen display of generosity, or a subtle assertion of authority could strengthen loyalty and deter potential challengers. Conversely, failure to act decisively, or the misreading of intentions, could erode influence and invite confrontation. The tension between maintaining respect and navigating ambition created a delicate, continuous balance that defined much of Gotti's interactions during this period. External threats further complicated the landscape. Law enforcement scrutiny, rival mafia families, and the ever-present possibility of informants created a constant background of tension. Every meeting, transaction, and conversation carried with it the risk of exposure, requiring discretion and strategic foresight. Gotti's ability to maintain composure, read situations accurately, and anticipate potential challenges became essential tools for survival. The interplay between internal rivalries and external pressures shaped his approach to leadership, reinforcing the importance of vigilance, adaptability, and the careful management of both human relationships and operational decisions. Conflict resolution became a critical skill during this time. Gotti recognized that open confrontation was often undesirable, as it could escalate tensions, draw unwanted attention, or destabilize alliances. Instead, he employed a combination of diplomacy, subtle intimidation, and strategic negotiation to manage disputes. By addressing conflicts quietly and decisively, he reinforced his authority while preserving the cohesion of his network. Allies learned that loyalty was rewarded, while challenges were met with measured but firm responses. This approach allowed Gotti to consolidate influence while maintaining an image of controlled authority, blending respect, fear, and strategic foresight in a way that reinforced his position. Observation of rivals was equally vital. Gotti understood that knowledge was power and that the ability to anticipate moves before they occurred could prevent crises or exploit opportunities. He monitored behavior, inferred intentions, and analyzed patterns of interaction with a meticulous attention to detail. This vigilance extended beyond immediate associates to include competitors in other families, potential informants, and even peripheral figures whose actions could indirectly influence outcomes. The ability to perceive threats early and act strategically became one of Gotti's most defining attributes, allowing him to maintain dominance in an environment where volatility and danger were ever present. Subtlety and timing were recurring themes in Gotti's navigation of rivalries and betrayal. He recognized that influence was as much a function of when and how he acted as it was of what actions he took. Strategic patience often allowed him to consolidate power quietly, reinforcing loyalty while minimizing exposure to risk. Similarly, carefully chosen interventions could diffuse tension, redirect ambitions, or neutralize threats without overt confrontation. In these ways, Gotti's approach reflected a deep understanding of human behavior, social dynamics, and the complex interplay between perception and action within the world of organized crime. The psychological dimension of these rivalries cannot be understated. Fear, respect, ambition, and envy all intertwine to create a landscape of tension and uncertainty. Gotti's ability to project calm confidence, to remain unreadable when necessary, and to exercise influence without overt coercion allowed him to navigate this environment effectively. Allies and rivals alike were attuned to his presence, aware that he could act decisively when required, yet also capable of measured patience and strategic restraint. This combination of traits reinforced his authority and enhanced his capacity to manage both internal and external pressures. Even within moments of apparent stability, the potential for disruption was constant. Subtle changes in loyalty, unanticipated opportunities, or shifts in power dynamics required continuous vigilance. Gotti's skill lay in his ability to integrate observation, strategic foresight, and operational competence into a coherent approach that allowed him to maintain authority while minimizing risk. Every interaction, whether social, operational, or strategic, carried with it the potential to reinforce or undermine his influence, and he approached each with a deliberate, measured attention to detail. As John Gotti's influence within the Gambino family grew, so too did his awareness of the power of perception. While many figures in the underworld preferred to remain invisible, moving through shadows and secrecy, Gotti began to understand that visibility could be a tool, a form of influence as potent as any criminal enterprise. It was during this period that the persona of the Dapper Don began to emerge, a carefully cultivated image that combined style, charisma, and audacity into a presence that would capture the attention of both allies and adversaries alike. Unlike the quiet, methodical leaders who often operated in obscurity, Gotti embraced public attention, recognizing that the world beyond the mafia was both audience and amplifier for his carefully constructed identity. The term Dapper Don did not emerge by chance. Gotti understood that appearance could convey power, control, and confidence without a word being spoken. Tailored suits, crisp shirts, polished shoes, and the ever-present slicked back hair created a visual signature that distinguished him from both peers and rivals. In an era when fashion and demeanor could serve as indicators of status, his attention to detail reinforced his authority. Every gesture, every glance, every carefully measured smile contributed to a presence that was simultaneously approachable and commanding. The aesthetic was not merely vanity, it was strategy, a way of asserting dominance, signaling sophistication, and reinforcing the perception of competence and control. Public appearances, though carefully chosen, became stages upon which this persona was displayed. Photographs outside courthouses, brief encounters with journalists, and appearances at social gatherings allowed Gotti to project both confidence and accessibility. He understood that the media, while potentially a threat, could also be a vehicle for influence, shaping the perceptions of the public, law enforcement, and even rival criminal factions. By maintaining composure, demonstrating poise, and projecting charisma, he cultivated a mystique that elevated him beyond a simple operator in organized crime to a figure of fascination, admiration, and, in some cases, fear. The interplay between image and reality was central to the creation of the Dapper Don. While Gotti's criminal activities were serious, calculated, and often ruthless, the public persona emphasized control, style, and charisma. This duality allowed him to navigate the world in which he operated with an added layer of protection. Perception became a shield. Allies were inspired and reassured by his confidence, while rivals were unsettled by the combination of audacity and composure. Law enforcement, tasked with pursuing evidence and convictions, found themselves contending with a figure whose carefully managed image complicated their efforts, creating both intrigue and frustration. Gotti's media interactions were subtle but deliberate. He did not court publicity recklessly, nor did he seek to dominate every narrative. Instead, he allowed his presence to be noticed, projecting an image of authority and composure that attracted attention while maintaining a layer of control. A photograph taken outside a courthouse could be a quiet statement of confidence, a brief conversation with a reporter could convey both charm and discretion. In this way, Gotti transformed public perception into a tool, reinforcing his authority within the family and projecting influence beyond it. Each calculated exposure contributed to the legend that would later define him as much as his criminal achievements. The Dapper Don persona also served to mask vulnerability. By projecting confidence, control, and style, Gotti reduced the perception of risk, both in the eyes of associates and rivals. Subtle cues, body language, gaze, tone, were employed to reinforce the sense of composure and authority. This mastery of presentation allowed him to navigate high-stakes situations with an added layer of psychological advantage. Allies felt secure under his leadership, rivals hesitated to challenge him, and observers were drawn into a narrative that balanced charisma with latent threat. In this interplay of style and strategy, perception became a central mechanism of power. Fashion and style were not mere aesthetics, they were a form of communication. A perfectly tailored suit could signal success and competence, the careful arrangement of accessories could indicate attention to detail, strategic thinking, and personal discipline. Gotti understood that humans respond intuitively to visual cues, and he leveraged this knowledge to shape interactions, reinforce hierarchy, and project influence. The careful cultivation of the Dapper Don image was a continuous process, refined over time to maximize its impact while remaining authentic to the persona he wished to convey. Beyond appearance, Gotti's demeanor contributed significantly to the mystique. Calm composure, measured speech, and controlled gestures created an aura of reliability and authority. Even in moments of tension or uncertainty, he maintained a posture of confidence, signaling both to allies and rivals that he possessed mastery over circumstance. This behavioral control complemented the visual aspects of the dapper Don persona, creating a multidimensional image that extended beyond clothing into psychological influence, shaping interactions and expectations in subtle but powerful ways. The effect on the public was immediate and profound. Newspapers and television reports captured the striking visual of a sharply dressed, confident figure commanding attention even outside courtrooms or crime scenes. The media, fascinated by the contrast between charm and criminality, amplified this image, embedding the dapper Don into the cultural consciousness. Audiences were drawn to the narrative of a man who navigated danger with style, blending sophistication and menace in a way that seemed almost cinematic. This external fascination reinforced Gotti's influence, turning perception into a tool for both operational advantage and psychological impact. Allies within the Gambino family also responded to the dapper Don persona. The carefully cultivated image reinforced respect, loyalty, and a sense of stability. Associates who witnessed his composure and attention to detail understood that his leadership was not merely a function of audacity but of strategic thought, disciplined execution, and the ability to navigate complex human dynamics. In this way, Gotti's persona served both internal and external purposes, enhancing his authority, solidifying loyalty, and projecting influence in multiple dimensions. Even rivals were affected by this carefully managed image. The projection of confidence, style, and composure created uncertainty and hesitation among competitors, making it more difficult for them to gauge his intentions or anticipate his actions. In a world where perception often influences behavior as much as direct action, the dapper Don persona became a strategic asset, providing both psychological leverage and a layer of protection. Gotti's mastery of image and influence illustrates the intricate interplay between appearance, behavior, and strategy, highlighting the sophisticated methods by which he navigated the complex terrain of organized crime. The creation of the dapper Don persona was therefore both an art and a science. It required careful attention to visual presentation, behavioral control, timing, and audience perception. It demanded an understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and the strategic use of public attention. Gotti's ability to synthesize these elements into a coherent and compelling persona contributed significantly to his rise, reinforcing both his authority and his mystique. The dapper Don was not merely a nickname, it was a carefully cultivated identity that amplified his influence, protected his position, and shaped the perceptions of those who interacted with him, whether as allies, rivals, or observers from afar. As listeners drift through the narrative of this period, it becomes evident that Gotti's focus on image and perception was inseparable from his broader strategy of power. Style, demeanor, and charisma were not superficial, they were integral to the way he exercised influence, managed relationships, and navigated risk. The dapper Don was a persona that blended aesthetics, psychology, and strategic thinking into a single, compelling presence, allowing Gotti to project authority and maintain control in both visible and invisible arenas. In the quiet unfolding of these details, one can begin to understand how image, reputation, and perception became as important to his success as any operational skill, laying the foundation for the legend that would come to define him. By the mid-1980s, John Gotti had firmly established himself as a formidable presence within the Gambino family, and his reputation had begun to extend far beyond the confines of organized crime. It was during this period that the nickname Teflon Don began to emerge, a reflection of his uncanny ability to evade conviction despite repeated charges, investigations, and high-profile trials. To the public, law enforcement, and even his rivals, Gotti seemed untouchable, a man who moved through the most dangerous currents of New York's criminal underworld with an almost surreal immunity. The story of how he earned this moniker is both a narrative of meticulous strategy and a lesson in the power of perception, demonstrating how intelligence, timing, and charisma can intersect to create a near-mythical aura of invincibility. The Teflon Don persona was built gradually, rooted in years of careful preparation, operational success, and strategic decision-making. Gotti's earlier experiences, petty crime, mentorship, and the calculated rise within the Gambino family, had equipped him with a deep understanding of both human behavior and the legal system. He knew that reputation could influence outcomes, that confidence and composure could sway opinion, and that careful control of information was as important as any legal defense. Each trial, arrest, and investigation became an opportunity to demonstrate his ability to navigate danger, projecting an image of calm authority while the machinery of law enforcement worked tirelessly to bring him down. Courtroom appearances became stages upon which Gotti's mastery of perception was most evident. He presented himself with an air of confidence that bordered on theatrical, a carefully measured calm that contrasted sharply with the tension, scrutiny, and intimidation often associated with mafia trials. Observers noted his tailored suits, composed demeanor, and strategic timing in responses, all of which contributed to the perception of control and self-assuredness. Even under the intense glare of cameras, the probing questions of prosecutors, and the judgmental eyes of jurors, Gotti maintained a poise that seemed almost engineered to convey invulnerability. This ability to manage presence under extreme pressure became a defining characteristic of the Teflon Don. Behind the scenes, meticulous preparation played a critical role in his apparent invincibility. Gotti and his legal team scrutinized evidence, anticipated prosecutorial strategies, and planned every detail of testimony and argument. Each motion, objection, and procedural maneuver was calculated to create advantage and reduce exposure. He understood that success in court required more than charisma, it required mastery of the legal and psychological terrain, a careful orchestration of fact, perception, and timing. Even the smallest detail, a well-chosen word, a pause in response, a deliberate glance, could influence the outcome, reinforcing the aura of untouchability. The public perception of the Teflon Don was amplified by media coverage, which transformed Gotti into a figure of fascination, admiration, and fear. Headlines emphasized both his criminal associations and his apparent immunity, creating a narrative that was part legend, part reality. Television broadcasts, newspaper articles, and photographs outside courthouses contributed to a cultural mythos that extended beyond the immediate implications of his legal battles. For allies, this perception reinforced loyalty and confidence; for rivals, it introduced uncertainty and hesitation; and for law enforcement, it created a psychological challenge as much as a procedural one. Gotti understood the power of this narrative, and he navigated it with strategic awareness. Repeated acquittals, mistrials, and dropped charges reinforced the perception of the Teflon Don, each legal victory contributing to an almost mythic sense of invulnerability. Observers, both inside and outside the underworld, began to associate Gotti with a rare combination of audacity, intelligence, and luck, or, as some would later argue, skillful manipulation of circumstance. Every courtroom escape, every dismissed charge, and every thwarted investigation added a layer to the legend, creating a feedback loop in which reputation reinforced behavior, and behavior reinforced perception. Gotti's ability to emerge unscathed from repeated legal challenges was not random, it was the result of deliberate strategy, careful planning, and an understanding of human psychology that few could match. Gotti's composure in these high-stakes situations also highlighted his understanding of timing and strategic patience. He recognized when to assert himself, when to remain silent, and when to allow others, prosecutors, witnesses, or jurors, to underestimate him. This control over pacing and perception was crucial, allowing him to navigate the pressures of public scrutiny without losing the confidence of allies or the respect of rivals. Even moments of uncertainty were managed with a subtle blend of charm and authority, reinforcing the perception of dominance and mastery. For listeners, this period illustrates the intersection of intelligence, strategy, and psychological insight in creating an almost impenetrable aura of control. The Teflon Don persona also served a protective function beyond legal outcomes. By cultivating an image of invulnerability, Gotti reduced the likelihood of challenges from within the Gambino family and from rival factions. Associates were reassured by the perception that their leader could withstand both external pressure and internal disruption, fostering loyalty and stability. Rivals, conversely, were deterred from open confrontation, recognizing that any challenge would encounter both strategic foresight and psychological resilience. In this way, reputation itself became a form of power, influencing behavior and shaping outcomes in ways that extended beyond immediate actions. Even as his legal victories accumulated, Gotti remained attentive to the nuances of public perception. Media interactions, photographic opportunities, and casual appearances were managed to reinforce the image of confidence and control. The balance between visibility and discretion was delicate. Overexposure could invite scrutiny, while invisibility could erode influence. Gotti's skill lay in navigating this tension, projecting authority and charisma without appearing reckless or vulnerable. The careful orchestration of image, presence, and perception became an ongoing strategic effort, one that complemented his operational and leadership skills within the family. At the same time, Gotti's personal demeanor reinforced the Teflon Don mystique. Calm, collected, and measured, he exuded a sense of certainty that belied the chaos surrounding him. Even in moments of legal jeopardy, the tension of cross-examination, or the anticipation of jury deliberation, he maintained composure, signaling to allies and observers alike that he was in control. This psychological mastery extended to subtle gestures, tone of voice, and calculated pauses, all of which reinforced the perception of invincibility. The careful management of emotion, behavior, and presence became as important as any legal tactic in shaping outcomes. The legend of the Teflon Don was therefore not the product of chance, luck, or myth alone. It was the culmination of years of observation, strategy, and psychological insight. Gotti had learned to navigate complex social hierarchies, anticipate human behavior, and manage perception in ways that amplified both influence and resilience. Each courtroom appearance, each media interaction, and each public gesture was part of a deliberate pattern designed to protect, enhance, and project authority. The nickname itself became a symbol not just of legal success, but of a broader mastery over perception, influence, and human dynamics. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that the Teflon Don persona was an essential element of Gotti's rise. It was more than a nickname, it was a carefully cultivated identity, a strategic tool, and a psychological shield. By combining operational skill, legal acumen, media awareness, and psychological insight, Gotti created an image that reinforced loyalty, deterred rivals, and complicated the efforts of law enforcement. The interplay of strategy, perception, and personal charisma exemplifies the sophisticated approach that defined his life and cemented his place as one of the most captivating figures in the history of organized crime. For listeners, this narrative unfolds as both a story of tactical brilliance and a meditation on the subtle power of perception, revealing the delicate, almost hypnotic ways in which John Gotti navigated a world defined by danger, ambition, and human complexity. By the mid-1980s, John Gotti had moved beyond the perception of untouchable charisma into a phase of tangible, expansive authority within the Gambino family. His rise to prominence was no longer a matter of reputation alone, it was reflected in the control he exerted over operations, territories, and key figures within the organization. The streets and neighborhoods of New York, which had once served as a proving ground, now fell under a more structured and strategic dominion. Gotti's understanding of power, perception, and loyalty allowed him to consolidate influence in ways that were methodical, disciplined, and remarkably effective. Each step of consolidation reflected not only operational skill but also an acute understanding of human behavior, hierarchy, and the interplay between fear and respect. Territorial control became a cornerstone of Gotti's expanding empire. The neighborhoods, businesses, and operations under his oversight were carefully mapped and managed, ensuring both efficiency and security. Key figures within the family were assigned responsibilities that leveraged their strengths, while strategic oversight minimized the risk of mistakes or betrayals. Gotti recognized that authority was reinforced not simply by asserting dominance, but by demonstrating competence, reliability, and the capacity to manage both people and resources effectively. This balance between leadership and delegation created a system in which his influence extended far beyond the visible boundaries of his immediate operations. The financial dimensions of consolidation were equally significant. Gotti oversaw a network of revenue-generating activities, including gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and other enterprises. Each operation was integrated into a broader framework of control, ensuring that profits were maximized, risk was mitigated, and loyalty was maintained through shared benefit. Generosity toward trusted associates reinforced allegiance, while the careful allocation of resources strengthened organizational cohesion. Gotti understood that influence was both a function of power and perception, and that financial control was a tangible manifestation of both. The empire he built was as much about relationships, trust, and loyalty as it was about money or territorial dominance. Strategic alliances were central to Gotti's approach. Within the Gambino family, factions often competed for influence, and the ability to secure loyalty was crucial. Gotti cultivated relationships through a combination of respect, strategic generosity, and psychological insight. He recognized that people respond not only to direct incentives but also to perception, reputation, and subtle cues of authority. By carefully managing these relationships, he ensured that his influence was both extensive and resilient, reducing the likelihood of internal dissent and reinforcing his position as a figure whose authority was acknowledged and respected. This network of loyalty became both a protective shield and a foundation for further expansion. The expansion of the Gambino Empire under Gotti was also marked by a keen understanding of risk management. Operations were planned with attention to contingencies, potential exposure, and the interplay of legal and social pressures. Gotti's earlier experiences, the mentorships, street lessons, and operational practice, had honed his ability to anticipate challenges and respond strategically. He recognized that authority was not merely about executing plans, but about maintaining stability, trust, and cohesion in an environment defined by unpredictability. Each operation, each allocation of territory, and each negotiation was carefully considered to reinforce control while minimizing vulnerability. Communication and coordination were vital to the functioning of this growing network. Gotti ensured that key associates were informed, aligned, and motivated, while also preserving the necessary layers of discretion and secrecy. Meetings were conducted in secure, controlled environments, and information was disseminated strategically to maintain operational security. The balance between transparency and discretion created a disciplined hierarchy in which loyalty, competence, and reliability were continuously reinforced. This approach not only increased the efficiency of operations but also enhanced Gotti's reputation as a leader who could be trusted to manage both people and enterprise effectively. Gotti's consolidation of power was also psychological. He understood the interplay between fear and respect, and he calibrated his actions to maintain both. Displays of authority, decisive interventions in disputes, and the subtle reinforcement of loyalty all contributed to a perception of competence and dominance. Allies were reassured that their leader could manage challenges, while potential rivals were deterred by the combination of strategic foresight and psychological presence. This careful orchestration of influence extended beyond immediate operations to shape the broader perception of the Gambino family, projecting both stability and authority across New York's criminal landscape. Even in the midst of consolidation, Gotti remained attentive to external pressures. Law enforcement scrutiny, rival families, and the unpredictable dynamics of the underworld required continuous vigilance. He monitored potential threats, assessed vulnerabilities, and anticipated challenges, ensuring that his expansion did not invite unnecessary exposure or conflict. This strategic awareness allowed him to extend influence while maintaining control, creating a framework in which operational growth was balanced with risk management and psychological strategy. Gotti's empire, in this sense, was not merely a collection of criminal enterprises, it was a carefully maintained ecosystem in which every element reinforced stability, authority, and loyalty. The public dimension of Gotti's consolidation further reinforced his authority. As the Dapper Don and Teflon Don, his image in the media and public perception amplified the power he exercised behind the scenes. Allies and subordinates were reassured by the visibility of competence and charisma, while rivals were confronted with the psychological weight of reputation. Gotti understood that perception could be leveraged as effectively as action, and that the careful cultivation of image extended the reach of influence beyond immediate operations. The empire he built was therefore both tangible and symbolic, grounded in territory, finance, and loyalty, yet amplified by the mythos of authority and control. Leadership during this period required both decisiveness and adaptability. Gotti faced challenges from ambitious associates, rival factions, and the constant threat of legal intervention. Each challenge demanded a calibrated response, blending authority, negotiation, and strategic foresight. His ability to adapt to shifting circumstances while maintaining control reinforced the perception of stability and competence. Allies observed his measured responses, while potential challengers recognized the calculated precision with which he managed conflict. The interplay of strategy, psychology, and operational skill solidified his position, ensuring that the empire he was building remained cohesive, resilient, and increasingly influential. The consolidation of the Gambino Empire under Gotti was also a study in patience. Expansion was methodical, each step calculated to reinforce control, build loyalty, and manage risk. The interplay of operational execution, territorial management, financial oversight, and psychological influence created a system in which authority was both reinforced and self-sustaining. Gotti's understanding of timing, perception, and strategic patience allowed him to navigate the complexities of power while minimizing exposure to unnecessary danger. This careful approach ensured that his rise was stable, coherent, and capable of withstanding both internal and external pressures. By the end of this period, John Gotti had not only secured his position within the Gambino family but had also transformed the organization into an entity more cohesive, disciplined, and strategically managed than it had been before his leadership. His consolidation of power reflected not merely ambition but a deep understanding of human behavior, operational strategy, and psychological influence. Every decision, every alliance, and every territorial adjustment contributed to a system in which influence, loyalty, and perception reinforced one another, creating an empire that was as much a network of relationships as it was a collection of criminal enterprises. For listeners, the unfolding of this phase reveals the quiet intricacy of leadership, strategy, and influence, offering a window into the deliberate, patient, and sophisticated methods by which Gotti transformed potential into dominance, ambition into empire, and perception into authority. As John Gotti's power and influence expanded within the Gambino family, the attention of law enforcement began to intensify. The FBI, along with other federal agencies, had been monitoring organized crime for decades, and Gotti's high-profile activities, public persona, and expanding empire inevitably drew scrutiny. What distinguished Gotti from many of his predecessors and contemporaries, however, was the combination of visibility and evasion. While his reputation grew in the public eye, law enforcement struggled to penetrate the careful layers of discretion and strategy he had built around himself. The early stages of surveillance introduced a new dimension to his life, one defined by vigilance, anticipation, and the subtle tension of operating under constant observation. Surveillance in the 1980s was both technical and psychological. Agents placed wiretaps in suspected locations, monitored phone calls, and followed key associates, piecing together patterns that might reveal criminal activity. Gotti, ever perceptive, understood the implications of these methods, even if the full extent of the FBI's reach was not always visible to him. The presence of unseen observers introduced an invisible layer of tension into daily operations. Routine meetings, transactions, and communications were no longer simply exercises in efficiency or negotiation, they were subject to potential interception, requiring greater caution, subtlety, and awareness. Every gesture, every word, every decision carried the weight of potential exposure, making vigilance an essential component of daily life. The psychological impact of this scrutiny cannot be understated. Operating under the knowledge that every conversation could be recorded, every movement observed, and every decision scrutinized creates a persistent undercurrent of tension. Gotti, who had built a career on careful observation and strategic calculation, adapted to this environment with remarkable composure. He refined his methods of communication, adjusted meeting locations, and implemented contingency plans to manage risk. The awareness of surveillance did not immobilize him, rather, it heightened his attentiveness, sharpening his instincts and reinforcing the strategic discipline that had long been a hallmark of his operations. The tools of law enforcement were extensive but not infallible. Surveillance teams relied on a combination of technology, informants, and observation to construct a narrative of criminal activity. Yet Gotti's careful planning, combined with his understanding of human behavior and environmental cues, allowed him to operate within the margins of uncertainty. He trained associates in the importance of discretion, structured meetings to minimize exposure, and cultivated an awareness of potential vulnerabilities. Each operational decision was filtered through a lens of risk assessment, balancing the need for action against the potential consequences of detection. The result was a system in which vigilance, anticipation, and strategic behavior became inseparable from the execution of criminal enterprise. Trust, or the careful management thereof, became increasingly critical under surveillance. Gotti recognized that even a single compromised associate could provide law enforcement with insight into the broader network of operations. This awareness reinforced the importance of loyalty, reliability, and discretion within his inner circle. Associates were chosen not merely for competence but for their ability to adhere to protocols, maintain confidentiality, and understand the stakes of operational security. Each interaction, each assignment, was evaluated through the lens of both performance and trustworthiness, creating a disciplined network capable of operating effectively under persistent observation. Paranoia, in this context, was not irrational, it was a survival mechanism. Gotti developed a heightened sense of anticipation, a psychological radar for detecting potential threats, leaks, or vulnerabilities. Even casual interactions or seemingly inconsequential details could carry significance, and the ability to interpret these cues accurately was critical. He learned to assess risk continuously, adapting both behavior and operational procedures in response to subtle shifts in circumstance. This constant vigilance was mentally taxing, yet it was also a reflection of his strategic acumen, transforming potential anxiety into actionable awareness that reinforced control and operational stability. The interplay between surveillance and perception was particularly significant. Gotti understood that law enforcement attention could be leveraged strategically, using awareness of observation to guide behavior, manage reputation, and influence outcomes. In public, he projected composure and confidence, signaling control and capability despite the unseen pressures of investigation. Within the organization, he used the awareness of scrutiny to reinforce discipline, maintain loyalty, and ensure operational consistency. In this sense, surveillance became both a constraint and a tool, a challenge to be managed, and a factor to be incorporated into strategic thinking. Adapting to this environment required meticulous attention to routine and environment. Locations for meetings were rotated, communications were carefully structured, and timing was adjusted to minimize exposure. Gotti's previous experience with strategic planning, observation, and operational control provided a foundation for these adaptations. He understood that law enforcement efforts were methodical, relying on patterns and predictability. By introducing variability, controlling information, and reinforcing operational discipline, he maintained the upper hand in an environment increasingly defined by invisible pressures. The broader social environment of New York also influenced the nature of surveillance. Urban density, overlapping jurisdictions, and the presence of both legitimate and illegitimate networks created both challenges and opportunities for law enforcement. Gotti's awareness of these dynamics allowed him to navigate them strategically, exploiting the complexities of the environment to maintain operational security. As John Gotti's prominence within the Gambino family continued to grow, the significance of his inner circle became increasingly apparent. Power, influence, and authority within organized crime were never solitary achievements, they relied upon a network of trusted allies, confidants, and operatives whose loyalty and discretion could mean the difference between consolidation and collapse. For Gotti, cultivating and maintaining this network was a deliberate, ongoing process, requiring keen observation, strategic planning, and an intuitive understanding of human behavior. The inner circle was more than just a professional necessity, it was a psychological and operational foundation, a framework upon which the Teflon Don's empire rested. The relationships within this inner circle were built on a complex interplay of trust, respect, and mutual benefit. Gotti understood that loyalty could not be commanded, it had to be earned and continuously reinforced. Acts of generosity, protection, and strategic support strengthened bonds, while the careful management of assignments, responsibilities, and influence cultivated respect. Associates were selected not merely for skill but for reliability, discretion, and the ability to operate under pressure. In this way, Gotti ensured that his closest allies were not only competent in execution but also aligned with his broader vision and strategy, capable of sustaining operational integrity in high-stakes situations. Communication was central to the cohesion of this network. Gotti maintained a balance between transparency and discretion, ensuring that his confidants were informed of critical developments without overexposing sensitive information. Meetings were conducted in secure locations, often shielded from casual observation, and discussions were framed to reinforce both understanding and loyalty. Instructions were delivered clearly, yet associates were empowered to exercise judgment within defined parameters, fostering both accountability and initiative. This balance of guidance and autonomy reinforced trust while maintaining operational discipline, creating a resilient network capable of adapting to the dynamic challenges of the criminal underworld. The psychological dimension of these relationships was equally important. Gotti's ability to read people, interpret subtle cues, and anticipate behavior allowed him to manage his inner circle with precision. He understood the interplay between respect and fear, reward and consequence, and influence and autonomy. By calibrating interactions to reinforce loyalty while subtly asserting authority, he maintained cohesion and minimized the risk of dissent or betrayal. Each conversation, gesture, and decision carried both operational and psychological weight, shaping perception, behavior, and the overall dynamics of the network. Strategic loyalty was cultivated through shared risk and opportunity. Associates were often involved in operations where success depended on cooperation, competence, and discretion. The outcomes of these ventures reinforced trust, as allies experienced firsthand the rewards of alignment with Gotti's leadership. Shared exposure to risk created a bond that transcended mere employment or obligation, embedding loyalty within the practical realities of their shared enterprise. For Gotti, these experiences were both operationally necessary and psychologically reinforcing, ensuring that allegiance was grounded in action, consequence, and mutual benefit. The inner circle was also a site of mentorship and development. Gotti recognized the importance of nurturing talent, cultivating capability, and preparing the next generation of operatives for increasing responsibility. Associates were trained not only in practical execution but also in strategic thinking, risk assessment, and the subtle dynamics of influence and perception. This cultivation of skill and judgment reinforced loyalty, enhanced operational effectiveness, and ensured that the network could sustain itself even as circumstances evolved. In this way, the inner circle became a microcosm of Gotti's broader approach to leadership, a careful blend of guidance, empowerment, and strategic oversight. Conflict management within the inner circle was a delicate but critical task. Differences in opinion, ambition, or temperament could threaten cohesion, yet Gotti approached such challenges with a combination of authority, negotiation, and subtle reinforcement of loyalty. Disputes were addressed discreetly, with attention to both immediate resolution and long-term relational stability. Associates learned that challenges to authority would be met with measured responses, while loyalty and competence were consistently rewarded. This approach created a culture of disciplined respect, in which operational objectives were prioritized and interpersonal dynamics were carefully managed to maintain cohesion. Observation and intelligence gathering were ongoing priorities. Gotti understood that even trusted allies could become points of vulnerability if their intentions shifted or if they were influenced by external pressures. He monitored behavior, interpreted subtle signals, and adjusted his approach as needed to maintain alignment and minimize risk. This vigilance was not paranoia, it was strategic awareness, an understanding that influence must be continuously reinforced and that operational security depended upon both trust and oversight. In this way, the inner circle operated as a dynamic, adaptive system, capable of sustaining Gotti's authority while mitigating the risks inherent in complex social networks. The interplay between loyalty and reward was central to maintaining cohesion. Associates received tangible benefits, financial, operational, or social, that reinforced their alignment with Gotti's leadership. Yet rewards were always balanced with expectations of competence, discretion, and adherence to strategy. This balance created a reciprocal relationship, where loyalty was both earned and maintained through consistent reinforcement of shared values, objectives, and operational discipline. It was a system in which trust, respect, and reward were intertwined, creating stability within an inherently volatile environment. The psychological influence of the Teflon Don extended beyond practical management. Gotti's composure, charisma, and reputation amplified his authority, reinforcing the perception that he was a leader whose judgment, foresight, and decisiveness could be relied upon. Associates internalized these perceptions, responding not only to direct instructions but also to the subtle signals of confidence and capability projected through behavior, demeanor, and strategic action. The inner circle, in effect, became both a functional and symbolic extension of Gotti's authority, embodying the operational, relational, and psychological dimensions of his leadership. Even in moments of tension or uncertainty, the inner circle demonstrated resilience. Loyalty was tested through operational challenges, legal scrutiny, and the ever-present possibility of conflict, yet the careful cultivation of relationships, disciplined communication, and strategic reinforcement of trust ensured stability. As John Gotti's influence solidified within the Gambino family, the darker realities of power became unavoidable. Leadership in the world of organized crime was not simply a matter of strategy, charisma, or financial management, it was inseparably entwined with violence, retribution, and the sometimes grim calculus of survival. For Gotti, the path to dominance required both operational skill and a willingness to confront the moral and practical complexities inherent in maintaining authority. The decisions he faced were rarely abstract, they involved real people, real consequences, and the weight of responsibility for both his allies and the broader organization. The life he had built demanded careful consideration of action, restraint, and timing, and it was within this environment that the violent dimensions of his world became both inevitable and instructive. Violence in the Gambino family was a language of authority. It conveyed messages that words alone could not, reinforcing loyalty, deterring rivals, and demonstrating control. Gotti's approach to these matters was both strategic and measured. He understood that the use of force carried risks, both legal and operational, and that rash or excessive action could destabilize alliances or attract unwanted attention. Yet he also recognized that hesitation in the face of challenge could be interpreted as weakness, undermining authority and eroding influence. The balance between decisiveness and discretion became a defining element of his leadership style, shaping both perception and operational reality. Throughout this period, Gotti's involvement in violent acts was carefully controlled, reflecting both practical necessity and strategic calculation. Decisions regarding hits, intimidation, and retribution were never made lightly, they were based on a combination of loyalty, risk assessment, and the maintenance of organizational cohesion. Associates who posed threats to stability, alliances that faltered, and rivals whose ambitions challenged authority were addressed in ways that reinforced the hierarchy while minimizing exposure to legal risk. Gotti's reputation for decisiveness and precision made these actions effective, yet his careful management ensured that violence served as a tool rather than a reckless expression of impulse. The psychological impact of violence extended to both allies and adversaries. Those within his inner circle understood that loyalty and competence were rewarded, but that failure or betrayal carried consequences. The subtle demonstration of resolve, whether through direct intervention or the orchestration of consequences, reinforced authority and discipline. For rivals and competitors, the knowledge that Gotti could and would act decisively created hesitation, caution, and respect. Violence, in this sense, was not merely reactive, it was an instrument of strategic influence, reinforcing the broader structures of control and power within the Gambino family. The execution of violent operations required meticulous planning. Gotti's previous experience in heists, operational management, and strategic leadership translated into an approach to retribution and enforcement that emphasized preparation, timing, and precision. Every detail, from personnel assignments to environmental considerations, from contingency planning to the assessment of potential consequences, was carefully considered. This methodical approach reduced the risk of exposure, ensured operational effectiveness, and maintained the integrity of the organization. In Gotti's hands, violence became a disciplined instrument, wielded with purpose rather than chaos, reflecting the same strategic sensibility that defined his broader leadership. Yet even as violence was operationalized, it carried moral weight. Gotti's decisions affected real lives, not only those of rivals but also the extended network of associates, families, and communities connected to the targets. The responsibility of leadership required an understanding of consequence that extended beyond immediate outcomes. Actions were weighed not only for effectiveness but also for their impact on loyalty, perception, and organizational stability. Gotti's ability to navigate this moral and practical terrain was a testament to both strategic intelligence and psychological acumen, allowing him to maintain authority while managing the complex ethical dimensions of his power. The violent path also reinforced the interconnectedness of perception and action. Public knowledge of Gotti's decisiveness, combined with the careful management of image and reputation, amplified the impact of any act of retribution. Allies internalized the message of competence and resolve, while rivals recalibrated their ambitions in light of demonstrated authority. This interplay between operational action and perception enhanced both deterrence and control, creating a feedback loop in which reputation and behavior reinforced one another. Gotti's mastery of this dynamic was central to the durability of his influence within the Gambino family and the broader underworld. The use of violence was further contextualized by the broader strategic environment. Rival factions, law enforcement pressure, and the constant threat of betrayal required that decisions be made within a matrix of competing risks. Gotti's ability to anticipate, assess, and act with both restraint and precision allowed him to navigate this landscape effectively. Violence was never gratuitous, it was a strategic choice, integrated into a larger framework of operational management, loyalty enforcement, and risk mitigation. Each action was considered not only for its immediate effect but also for its long-term implications, reflecting the sophisticated interplay of strategy, psychology, and operational discipline that characterized his leadership. Relationships within the inner circle were also shaped by the realities of violence. Trust and loyalty were reinforced through shared risk, mutual protection, and the observation of decisive action. Associates learned that Gotti's authority was backed by both strategic insight and operational capability, enhancing cohesion and commitment. The careful calibration of consequence and reward ensured that loyalty was meaningful, grounded in both respect and tangible experience. In this way, violence served not only as a tool of enforcement but also as a mechanism for reinforcing trust, cohesion, and operational stability. Even as the stakes increased, Gotti's composure remained a defining feature. The ability to remain calm, measured, and observant under pressure extended to the management of violence, ensuring that decisions were deliberate and calculated rather than impulsive. This composure reinforced perception, allowing allies to feel secure and rivals to recognize the deliberate authority behind every action. The psychological weight of controlled, strategic violence extended beyond immediate outcomes, shaping the broader dynamics of influence, reputation, and power within the organization. The cumulative effect of this period was the establishment of a leadership model in which violence was disciplined, strategic, and intertwined with perception and loyalty. By the mid-1980s, John Gotti had become more than a powerful figure within the Gambino family. He had transformed into a public sensation, a figure whose presence captured the fascination of the media, the public, and even law enforcement. The persona he had cultivated as the Dapper Don and the reputation of the Teflon Don combined to create a mythology that blurred the lines between criminal reality and legend. Newspapers, television broadcasts, and popular discourse framed him as simultaneously stylish, charismatic, and untouchable, a man whose life seemed to unfold according to a script that was part fact, part dramatized narrative. This fascination was not merely incidental. Gotti had learned to navigate the media, shaping public perception while maintaining control over the reality of his operations. The media portrayal of Gotti was striking in its duality. On one hand, he was a feared and powerful mob boss, orchestrating complex criminal operations and commanding loyalty through both charisma and decisiveness. On the other, he was a public figure whose charm, style, and apparent composure made him captivating to audiences who may have had little understanding of the complexities of organized crime. The newspapers emphasized his tailored suits, confident demeanor, and courtroom composure, creating a visual and narrative signature that distinguished him from other figures in the underworld. Television reports amplified this image, offering both viewers and law enforcement a glimpse of a man who seemed to operate with remarkable control despite constant scrutiny. Gotti's engagement with public fascination was subtle but deliberate. He understood the power of visibility, recognizing that media coverage could reinforce both perception and influence. Courtroom appearances, carefully timed gestures, and moments of public visibility were orchestrated to maintain a narrative of confidence, composure, and authority. By allowing controlled exposure, he transformed media attention into a tool that enhanced loyalty among allies, deterred rivals, and complicated law enforcement efforts. Public fascination was thus intertwined with operational strategy, reinforcing the duality of image and reality that defined his rise. The blurring of myth and reality had profound implications. To the public, Gotti became an almost cinematic figure, a character whose life seemed to combine elements of drama, suspense, and audacity. Stories of his courtroom escapes, calculated operations, and charismatic presence contributed to a narrative that was part folklore, part biography. For allies and rivals within organized crime, this mythology reinforced the psychological weight of his authority. Observers internalized the narrative of invulnerability and decisiveness, which in turn influenced behavior, loyalty, and strategic calculations. The legend became both a reflection and a reinforcement of reality, illustrating the complex interplay between perception, action, and influence. Gotti's careful cultivation of image extended beyond appearances to encompass behavior, timing, and presence. He projected calm, controlled authority even in high-pressure situations, allowing allies to feel secure and rivals to recognize the calculated power behind his decisions. Each gesture, each pause, each carefully managed interaction contributed to the construction of a public persona that enhanced both operational effectiveness and personal influence. In this sense, Gotti's public image was not merely a consequence of notoriety, it was a deliberate, strategic element of leadership, integrated into the broader framework of control, perception, and psychological influence. The fascination surrounding Gotti was amplified by the interplay between media coverage and public curiosity. Stories of his criminal exploits, courtroom demeanor, and personal charisma were disseminated widely, creating a feedback loop in which attention reinforced reputation, and reputation reinforced attention. This cycle elevated Gotti from a figure operating primarily within the underworld to one whose presence permeated public consciousness. Newspapers and television broadcasts became instruments in the construction of legend, even as the reality of his operations continued largely unseen. For listeners, the tension between myth and fact offers an almost hypnotic narrative, drawing attention to the nuances of perception, influence, and psychological strategy. The duality of Gotti's public and private personas was also a key factor in the construction of fascination. While the public saw the dapper Don, confident and composed, those within his inner circle experienced a leader capable of strategic insight, decisiveness, and careful operational management. The contrast between these spheres reinforced both the mystique and the effectiveness of his leadership. Allies were inspired by competence and charisma, while the public and rivals were captivated by the narrative of invincibility and style. This interplay of perception and reality became a central component of Gotti's enduring influence, demonstrating the sophisticated blending of image, action, and psychology. The cultural fascination with Gotti extended beyond the immediate spheres of law enforcement and organized crime. He became a subject of popular discourse, inspiring stories, speculation, and myth-making in broader society. His life and persona were discussed in media reports, books, and documentaries, creating a narrative that transcended criminal activity and entered the realm of legend. The combination of style, audacity, and perceived untouchability resonated with audiences, reinforcing the perception of Gotti as both an extraordinary individual and a symbol of the interplay between power, charisma, and strategy. Gotti's awareness of this fascination informed his strategic choices. Media interactions were carefully calibrated, public appearances were timed and staged to reinforce perception, and behavior was managed to maintain both credibility and intrigue. He understood that perception could influence loyalty, deter competition, and shape public understanding, and he integrated this awareness into the broader management of his empire. By the late 1980s, John Gotti's world had grown both vast and precarious. The power he had amassed within the Gambino family, coupled with the public fascination surrounding the Dapper Don and Teflon Don personas, created a complex environment of influence, loyalty, and constant threat. While his empire appeared untouchable to the casual observer, the pressures of leadership were intensifying. Rivals within and outside the family were watching, law enforcement scrutiny was tightening, and the consequences of any misstep had escalated dramatically. Gotti's life at this stage was a delicate balance between strategic control and the persistent undercurrent of danger, a tension that shaped both decisions and daily routines. The world of organized crime is inherently unstable, and Gotti's rise had inevitably attracted envy, resentment, and ambition among other figures in the underworld. Rival families watched carefully, calculating when to challenge, negotiate, or wait for vulnerability. Even within the Gambino family, factions tested boundaries, questioned decisions, and weighed alliances. In this environment, perception was crucial. Gotti's ability to project confidence and decisiveness became a psychological tool, reinforcing loyalty among allies while deterring potential challengers. Yet the tension was constant, requiring vigilance, strategic foresight, and the capacity to respond effectively to threats without undermining authority. Law enforcement presented a parallel and equally pressing challenge. The FBI and federal prosecutors had intensified their efforts to infiltrate the Gambino organization, deploying wiretaps, surveillance teams, informants, and undercover operations. Every conversation, transaction, and movement carried potential consequences. Gotti's prior experience with observation and strategic planning now became essential. He monitored the behavior of associates, controlled communications, and implemented security measures to mitigate risk. The awareness of persistent scrutiny required mental acuity, patience, and a continuous calibration of operational procedures, blending caution with decisive action. The dual pressures of rival factions and law enforcement created a psychological landscape of heightened alertness. Gotti's understanding of human behavior, learned over decades on the streets, through mentorship, and in organizational leadership, became indispensable. He evaluated the reliability of associates, anticipated the ambitions of rivals, and assessed the likelihood of infiltration or betrayal. Every interaction, gesture, and conversation carried layered significance. The capacity to interpret subtle cues, detect shifts in loyalty, and project authority became a daily exercise in vigilance, reflecting both the operational demands and the psychological complexity of his position. Internal threats were often more subtle than overt confrontations. Ambition among lieutenants, dissatisfaction with allocations of resources, or the perception of favoritism could destabilize cohesion if left unchecked. Gotti's approach was both preventative and responsive. He maintained discipline through direct oversight, strategic reinforcement of loyalty, and careful allocation of operational responsibilities. Simultaneously, he projected an aura of authority that dissuaded dissent and encouraged compliance. The balance between enforcement and diplomacy required nuanced judgment, ensuring that threats were neutralized without fracturing the network of trust that sustained his influence. External rivalries were equally challenging. Competing crime families, ambitious figures outside his immediate sphere, and opportunistic actors sought to exploit perceived vulnerabilities. Gotti's strategy combined deterrence, negotiation, and calculated displays of strength. By reinforcing both perception and operational capacity, he managed external threats with precision. Actions were taken to protect territories, safeguard revenue streams, and reinforce the loyalty of associates. The careful orchestration of influence and deterrence created a system in which potential challengers were discouraged from action, and the perception of invincibility was maintained. The cumulative effect of these pressures shaped Gotti's daily life in profound ways. Routine activities, meetings, communications, and operational oversight, were conducted with heightened awareness. Locations were chosen strategically, conversations were monitored, and information was carefully controlled. Gotti's composure, charisma, and decision-making were continuously tested, requiring both mental discipline and adaptive strategy. Even seemingly mundane actions, from personal appearances to minor operational decisions, carried implications for perception, influence, and security. The inner circle played a critical role in managing these pressures. Trusted associates acted as both operational partners and buffers, extending Gotti's capacity to monitor, manage, and respond to threats. Loyalty, competence, and discretion within this group were continuously reinforced through rewards, shared risk, and clear communication. The cohesion of the inner circle provided both operational resilience and psychological reassurance, enabling Gotti to exercise authority effectively despite the constant presence of danger and uncertainty. Strategic use of perception became increasingly significant. Gotti understood that maintaining an image of control, composure, and decisiveness could amplify influence while deterring challenge. Public appearances, media interactions, and internal communications were all calibrated to reinforce both reality and mythology. Allies drew confidence from the perception of authority, rivals hesitated in the face of carefully projected strength. This integration of psychological influence with operational management allowed Gotti to navigate a landscape in which tangible power and perceived invincibility were deeply intertwined. The intensity of this period also highlighted the human dimension of leadership under threat. Gotti was not immune to stress, uncertainty, or the moral complexity of his choices. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, John Gotti had reached the apex of his power, a period marked by both extraordinary influence within the Gambino family and widespread fascination in the public eye. The empire he had meticulously built, strengthened through loyalty, strategic foresight, and operational skill, now extended across New York, encompassing vast financial interests, territorial control, and a network of associates whose allegiance was both profound and disciplined. This era represented the culmination of years of careful cultivation, strategic maneuvering, and psychological mastery, a time when the Dapper Don and Teflon Don personas converged with practical authority to create an almost unparalleled dominance within organized crime. Gotti's control over the Gambino family was comprehensive, reflecting both hierarchical authority and the subtle reinforcement of influence. Key lieutenants and associates were carefully positioned to manage operations, territories, and revenue streams, creating a structure in which authority was both distributed and centralized. Gotti exercised oversight with precision, balancing delegation with direct involvement, ensuring that critical decisions aligned with his strategic vision. This balance allowed the organization to function with efficiency and adaptability, while simultaneously reinforcing his personal authority as the ultimate arbiter of loyalty, discipline, and operational direction. The psychological dimension of his dominance was particularly pronounced. Allies were acutely aware of both the benefits and consequences of alignment with Gotti's leadership. Generosity, protection, and opportunity were balanced with the expectation of competence, discretion, and loyalty. This dynamic created a culture of reinforced obedience, where trust was continuously earned and maintained through demonstrated capability and alignment with strategic objectives. At the same time, the perception of decisive authority discouraged dissent, internal rivalry, and opportunistic challenges, creating an environment in which cohesion and operational stability were maximized. Gotti's public persona played a crucial role in consolidating this dominance. The Dapper Don and Teflon Don images, cultivated through meticulous attention to style, behavior, and media engagement, extended his influence beyond the inner workings of the family. Public fascination with his courtroom composure, charisma, and apparent invincibility reinforced the psychological impact of his authority. Allies drew reassurance from the perception of strength and competence, rivals hesitated, cautious of provoking a leader whose operational skill was matched by the aura of untouchability. In this way, Gotti's public image became a force multiplier, amplifying both loyalty and deterrence in equal measure. Operational control during this period was extensive. Gotti oversaw a complex web of criminal enterprises, including gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and other revenue-generating activities. These operations were structured with attention to efficiency, security, and risk management, ensuring both profitability and resilience under scrutiny from law enforcement and rival factions. Gotti's earlier experiences, mentorship, street smarts, and tactical orchestration, had refined his capacity to integrate strategic planning with operational execution. Every venture was both a test of competence and an opportunity to reinforce authority, ensuring that the expansion of the empire was matched by disciplined control. The dynamics of loyalty and discipline were central to the maintenance of this dominance. Gotti's inner circle functioned as both an operational and psychological backbone, extending his influence and enabling him to manage complex networks with precision. Trust and reliability were continuously reinforced through a combination of reward, shared risk, and strategic oversight. The careful cultivation of these relationships ensured that the broader network of associates remained aligned, disciplined, and motivated, capable of executing operations with both independence and fidelity to Gotti's overarching objectives. This interweaving of operational effectiveness and relational management was a defining feature of his leadership style. The intersection of power and perception reached its peak during this era. Gotti understood that authority was reinforced not only by action but also by the consistent projection of composure, decisiveness, and charisma. Public appearances, media coverage, and internal interactions were orchestrated to communicate both capability and invulnerability. The subtle manipulation of perception complemented tangible control over operations, creating an environment in which influence extended across multiple dimensions. Allies internalized confidence, rivals recalibrated ambition, and the broader narrative of dominance was continually reinforced, blurring the line between reality and myth in a manner that strengthened cohesion and deterrence alike. Even as dominance solidified, the pressures of visibility, scrutiny, and rivalry were constant. Law enforcement attention intensified, rival factions remained alert to opportunities, and internal tensions required continuous management. Gotti's ability to maintain composure, anticipate threats, and act decisively under these conditions reflected a remarkable integration of operational intelligence, psychological insight, and strategic patience. The management of these overlapping pressures required both mental acuity and a disciplined approach to risk, ensuring that authority was maintained while operational and relational stability was preserved. Financial control was a key element of his peak power. Revenue streams were closely monitored, allocated strategically, and leveraged to reinforce loyalty and operational capability. Generosity toward trusted associates, strategic investments, and the careful management of both legitimate and illicit enterprises reinforced the perception of competence and strength. Money was both a tool and a symbol, demonstrating the practical success of leadership while signaling authority and reinforcing the social contract within the organization. Every financial decision contributed not only to profitability but also to cohesion, loyalty, and the broader consolidation of power. The interpersonal dimension of Gotti's dominance was equally critical. Relationships within the family, the inner circle, and the broader network were managed with acute attention to trust, respect, and psychological influence. Allies observed his decisiveness and composure, internalizing the signals of authority and competence. Potential challengers recognized both operational capability and the weight of reputation, often opting for alignment rather than confrontation. The careful calibration of relationships ensured that influence was maintained, loyalty reinforced, and the risks of internal disruption minimized. At the height of his dominance, Gotti's public persona and operational control were mutually reinforcing. Media fascination amplified perception, internal discipline reinforced operational efficiency, and strategic use of authority maintained cohesion across a complex organizational network. The interplay of visibility, psychological influence, and tangible control created a multi-layered system of power that was both robust and adaptive. Gotti's leadership was characterized by a sophisticated understanding of human behavior, operational strategy, and the subtle interplay between perception and action, allowing him to navigate an environment of intense scrutiny, internal rivalry, and external threat with remarkable effectiveness. This period also highlighted the moral and psychological complexity of power. Gotti was acutely aware that every decision, action, and display of authority carried consequences, both operational and human. The balance between loyalty, enforcement, and public image required constant negotiation, blending strategy with the management of perception and expectation. Each choice reinforced authority, mitigated risk, and sustained cohesion, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of leadership under pressure. For listeners, the height of Gotti's dominance offers insight into the intricate, almost hypnotic interplay of influence, perception, and operational control that defines leadership in high-stakes, high-risk environments. By the time this era reached its peak, John Gotti had become an almost mythical figure. His authority within the Gambino family was comprehensive, his influence extended across operations, territory, and personnel, and his public persona amplified the perception of untouchable power. Every decision, every gesture, and every strategic action contributed to a narrative of dominance, reinforcing loyalty, deterring rivals, and shaping both reality and legend. In the quiet unfolding of these years, the full complexity of his power, its operational, psychological, and symbolic dimensions, becomes apparent, offering a window into the extraordinary skill, discipline, and strategic intelligence that defined John Gotti at the height of his influence. Even at the height of his power, John Gotti could not escape the inexorable forces that accompany prominence in the underworld. The same visibility that had elevated him to near mythical status also drew scrutiny from law enforcement, rival factions, and internal critics. By the early 1990s, the landscape was beginning to shift. Federal investigations intensified, focusing on the intricate web of criminal enterprises he had meticulously constructed. The networks of surveillance, informants, and undercover operations orchestrated by the FBI and the Department of Justice began to close in, creating an environment where strategic foresight and operational control were tested as never before. The tension was palpable, every meeting, conversation, and transaction carried the potential for exposure, and the stakes had never been higher. The indictments that began to accumulate against Gotti marked the first serious cracks in the sense of untouchability he had cultivated over the preceding decade. Charges of racketeering, extortion, and murder conspiracy painted a vivid picture of his involvement in organized crime, and the legal apparatus marshaled against him was sophisticated, relentless, and deeply experienced. For someone who had spent years navigating the dynamics of loyalty, influence, and perception, these proceedings demanded a recalibration of strategy, heightened caution, and unprecedented attention to both personal behavior and operational detail. Even routine decisions required careful consideration in light of the growing legal threat. The psychological impact of these indictments cannot be understated. For years, Gotti had projected confidence and composure, blending charisma with strategic foresight to create the illusion, and often the reality, of invulnerability. Now, that composure was tested by the tangible possibility of incarceration, the potential betrayal of associates, and the relentless observation of law enforcement. The world he had controlled with such precision began to show signs of fragility. Subtle shifts in loyalty, pressure from witnesses, and increased surveillance introduced a layer of tension that demanded both emotional discipline and analytical acuity. The Teflon Don, once seemingly untouchable, was confronted by the intricate machinery of law enforcement designed to pierce even the most carefully constructed shields of secrecy. Rival factions, both within the mafia and in competing criminal enterprises, sensed opportunity. The perception of vulnerability encouraged jockeying for influence, challenges to authority, and subtle acts of defiance. Even loyal associates were placed in positions where fear, uncertainty, and the pressures of the law could strain relationships. Gotti's leadership was tested not only by external forces but by the internal dynamics of an empire under threat. Maintaining cohesion required a blend of reassurance, discipline, and psychological reinforcement, ensuring that confidence, respect, and loyalty persisted even as the net of legal pressure tightened. Strategic adaptations became essential. Gotti implemented new security measures, adjusted communication protocols, and carefully managed operational activity to reduce exposure. Meetings were relocated, sensitive conversations were conducted with increased discretion, and the allocation of responsibility within the family was recalibrated to minimize risk. These adaptations were informed by decades of experience in observation, strategic planning, and operational oversight. Yet, even with meticulous management, the accumulation of legal pressure and the sophistication of federal investigation created a situation in which unpredictability and risk were unavoidable. The stakes were existential, and every decision carried weight far beyond immediate operational considerations. The legal strategy employed during this period was as much psychological as procedural. Gotti's lawyers leveraged his public persona, the Teflon Don reputation, and the complexity of evidence against him to influence perception, both in court and in the broader public. Jury dynamics, media attention, and the framing of narrative became critical elements of defense. Gotti himself maintained composure, projecting confidence in a manner consistent with his established public image, yet the underlying pressure of accumulated charges created a persistent tension that required careful management. The interplay of perception, reality, and legal strategy became a defining aspect of his response to these challenges. The personal dimension of this period was equally significant. Family life, long a source of grounding and stability, was affected by the increased attention, scrutiny, and operational strain. Victoria and their children were confronted with both the social implications of public notoriety and the tangible consequences of legal threat. Gotti's capacity to maintain a sense of normalcy within his household required delicate balancing, ensuring that the pressures of public and operational life did not erode the stability that had long been a source of psychological resilience. The interplay between domestic grounding and operational vigilance became a critical factor in sustaining composure under extraordinary circumstances. The cumulative effect of indictments and investigations began to alter the operational environment. Associates were subject to questioning, surveillance, and legal pressure, introducing uncertainty into previously reliable relationships. Decisions had to account for the possibility of exposure, betrayal, or misstep. Gotti's experience, observational skills, and strategic acumen were tested continuously, as the empire he had painstakingly built was now challenged on multiple fronts simultaneously. This period highlighted the fragility inherent in high-profile criminal power, where the same visibility that confers influence also invites pressure, scrutiny, and potential disruption. Psychologically, Gotti had to navigate the tension between confidence and vulnerability. The awareness of persistent legal threat, coupled with the potential for betrayal or opportunism, created an environment in which mental acuity and emotional regulation were paramount. Each interaction, operational decision, and public appearance carried layered significance. The Teflon Don's composure was maintained through deliberate management of perception, careful orchestration of behavior, and a disciplined approach to both strategic and operational challenges. This capacity to integrate psychological insight with practical action was a hallmark of his leadership style, even under the mounting pressures of decline. The shifting balance of power was also evident in the broader criminal ecosystem. Rival families, law enforcement, and opportunistic actors recalibrated their strategies in response to perceived vulnerabilities. Gotti's ability to maintain dominance relied not only on operational skill but on the continuous reinforcement of authority, loyalty, and perception. Strategic displays of decisiveness, reassurance of allies, and subtle psychological management became as critical as the execution of any criminal enterprise. The culmination of John Gotti's long and calculated ascent came in the early 1990s, a period defined by relentless legal pressure, trials, and ultimately, conviction. For years, Gotti had navigated the complex interplay of perception, operational control, and psychological influence, creating the mythos of the Teflon Don and consolidating power across the Gambino family. Yet even the most carefully constructed empire is vulnerable to persistence, intelligence, and the intricate machinery of law enforcement. The trials that followed were the most public, intense, and consequential tests of his leadership, strategy, and persona, forcing a confrontation with both reality and the limitations of influence that no preparation could fully neutralize. Courtrooms became the stage upon which the last act of Gotti's public saga would unfold. The proceedings were meticulously documented, heavily surveilled, and widely covered by media, drawing attention from across the nation. Prosecutors presented a comprehensive case, utilizing the fruits of extensive surveillance, informant testimony, and financial analysis to illustrate the scope of Gotti's criminal enterprise. Witnesses described operations, alliances, and acts of violence, constructing a narrative that revealed both the organizational structure of the Gambino family and Gotti's central role as leader. These trials were not only legal challenges but psychological arenas, where perception, composure, and strategy intersected with evidence, procedure, and human judgment. Gotti's demeanor in court reflected the cultivated confidence that had defined his public persona for decades. He presented himself with a calm, controlled presence, dressed impeccably, and responding to questioning with measured precision. The courtroom, filled with attorneys, jurors, and observers, became a mirror of his earlier strategies in public engagement, projecting authority, managing perception, and maintaining a psychological edge. Yet beneath the composed exterior, the stakes were unprecedented. The potential for long-term incarceration, the unraveling of his empire, and the destabilization of his inner circle weighed heavily on every decision, every gesture, and every word. The prosecution's strategy relied not only on evidence but also on demonstrating the consistency and reach of Gotti's operations. Testimonies detailed financial manipulation, coordinated criminal activities, and acts of intimidation and violence, revealing the meticulous planning that had allowed Gotti to consolidate control. The presentation was exhaustive, emphasizing both the tangible achievements of the empire and the mechanisms through which authority and influence were maintained. The juxtaposition of Gotti's public charisma with the detailed, methodical evidence presented a striking contrast, illustrating the complex dynamics between perception, myth, and operational reality. Witness credibility became a critical factor, highlighting the moral and psychological complexity of organized crime. Testimonies often came from former associates, insiders who had been persuaded or compelled to cooperate with law enforcement. Their accounts were detailed, sometimes contradictory, and invariably colored by personal experience, fear, or self-preservation. Gotti's legal team had to navigate these complexities, challenging credibility, emphasizing procedural concerns, and leveraging the nuances of testimony to create doubt. The courtroom became a space in which the interplay of human psychology, strategy, and perception determined outcomes as much as the concrete facts themselves. Media coverage amplified the stakes and the perception of Gotti's dominance. Public fascination with the Teflon Don narrative had not diminished. If anything, the trials intensified interest, creating a feedback loop in which reputation, scrutiny, and mythos interacted. Gotti's composed, charismatic presence was contrasted against the intense attention of journalists, cameras, and public discourse. This heightened visibility added psychological weight to every interaction, amplifying both the pressure and the stakes. The trials became an extension of the public stage upon which Gotti's persona, influence, and strategic acumen were continuously observed, analyzed, and interpreted. The legal process also exposed vulnerabilities inherent in high-profile criminal leadership. Despite decades of careful operational management, the accumulation of surveillance, informant testimony, and procedural documentation created a body of evidence difficult to counter. Associates' loyalty was tested under pressure, and the psychological strain of scrutiny impacted both decision-making and the cohesion of the inner circle. The strategic challenges of perception management, operational control, and psychological influence converged with the procedural rigor of the courts, creating a scenario in which even the most calculated leader could be challenged in ways that extended beyond operational skill or personal charisma. Gotti's defense strategy combined legal rigor with psychological presentation. Attorneys highlighted procedural flaws, questioned witness credibility, and emphasized gaps or inconsistencies in evidence. Simultaneously, Gotti maintained a calm, authoritative presence, reinforcing the perception of control and composure. The interplay of legal maneuvering and public perception underscored the multidimensional nature of influence, illustrating how leadership, strategy, and personality intersect in high-stakes environments. The courtroom became a microcosm of the broader dynamics that had defined his career, reflecting both the strengths and limits of perception, preparation, and influence. Ultimately, the weight of evidence, sustained pressure, and the challenges of maintaining cohesion under legal scrutiny led to Gotti's conviction. The Teflon Don, once seemingly impervious to legal consequence, was finally confronted by the limits of human and institutional capability. Conviction marked not only a personal turning point but a transformation in the operational and organizational reality of the Gambino family. Authority, influence, and the carefully cultivated mythos of invulnerability were disrupted, demonstrating the inexorable consequences of scrutiny, exposure, and persistent challenge, even for figures of extraordinary skill and charisma. The unraveling of the empire under legal pressure highlighted the interconnectedness of perception, loyalty, and operational management. Associates and rivals alike were forced to navigate the new landscape, recalibrating alliances, responsibilities, and expectations. The psychological impact of conviction reverberated through the organization, altering both behavior and perception. Gotti's composure, influence, and authority, which had once projected stability and deterrence, were confronted by the tangible consequences of legal intervention, revealing both the power and fragility inherent in high-profile leadership. Reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that the trials and conviction of John Gotti represent a profound intersection of strategy, perception, and consequence. His rise and dominance were shaped by meticulous planning, psychological insight, and operational discipline, yet even the most sophisticated structures are vulnerable to cumulative pressure, scrutiny, and persistent challenge. The courtroom became a theater in which the limits of influence were tested, demonstrating that leadership, mythos, and strategic acumen are continually negotiated against the forces of accountability, evidence, and human complexity. For listeners, this phase of Gotti's life offers a deeply immersive view into the vulnerabilities that accompany power, highlighting the interplay between perception, reality, and the inexorable consequences of action. The conclusion of these trials signaled not only a legal defeat but the beginning of the dismantling of the mythic narrative he had cultivated. The Teflon Don persona, which had allowed him to evade conviction for so long, was confronted by systematic, persistent scrutiny. Yet even in this moment of transition, the psychological and operational sophistication that defined Gotti's career remained evident, offering a final testament to the intricate, disciplined, and multidimensional nature of his leadership. The trials and conviction reveal the delicate balance between power, perception, and consequence, providing a compelling meditation on the limits of invulnerability in the life of one of New York's most legendary figures. The story of John Gotti concludes not with sudden disappearance but with reflection on the complexities of power, perception, and human ambition. His life, which spanned from the streets of Brooklyn to the apex of organized crime, offers a narrative rich in both caution and fascination. By the time his influence waned and legal consequences fully took hold, Gotti had become more than a man operating within the Gambino family. He had become a cultural figure, a symbol of charisma, audacity, and the intricate interplay of myth and reality. His legacy is layered, a tapestry woven from operational brilliance, psychological insight, and the enduring impact of a public persona that captivated and provoked in equal measure. In examining Gotti's life, one cannot overlook the duality that defined him. On one hand, he was a man capable of extraordinary strategic foresight, operational skill, and meticulous management of both people and resources. The empire he built was a reflection of patience, discipline, and a deep understanding of human behavior. Each decision, from the allocation of responsibilities within the Gambino family to the careful orchestration of public appearances, demonstrated an ability to navigate complexity with a blend of intelligence and instinct. On the other hand, Gotti's life was inextricably intertwined with violence, risk, and moral ambiguity. The authority he exercised often relied on fear, intimidation, and the capacity for ruthless decision-making, reminding us that power in the underworld is never without cost. The mythos of the Teflon Don and Dapper Don illustrates the profound role of perception in leadership. Gotti's ability to cultivate an image that blended charisma, confidence, and strategic unpredictability amplified his influence beyond immediate operations. Allies were inspired, rivals were deterred, and public fascination elevated him to near mythical status. This duality, between reality and perception, was not accidental, it was a product of careful attention to behavior, timing, and psychological cues. Gotti understood that influence is as much a function of how one is perceived as of concrete action, and he leveraged this insight throughout his rise to dominance. Even as legal consequences dismantled the practical structures of his empire, the narrative surrounding Gotti endured. Media coverage, books, documentaries, and public discourse continued to explore the tension between charisma, criminality, and invulnerability. In this sense, his influence extended beyond direct control, entering the cultural consciousness as a symbol of both audacity and the complex dynamics of power. The fascination with Gotti illustrates the enduring human interest in figures who navigate extreme circumstances with intelligence, composure, and an ability to manipulate both perception and reality. His legacy is therefore as much about psychology and myth as it is about operational achievement. Family and personal life provide an equally compelling lens through which to view Gotti's legacy. Despite the dangers and pressures of his criminal career, he maintained a commitment to his household, nurturing relationships with Victoria and their children. The home became a sanctuary amid the turbulence of public and operational life, offering stability, grounding, and a space for human connection. These domestic dimensions reveal a man capable of tenderness, responsibility, and care, juxtaposed against the ruthlessness required by his professional world. The coexistence of these spheres underscores the complexity of human behavior, illustrating how ordinary life can persist even in extraordinary circumstances. The lessons of loyalty and trust, cultivated throughout his career, continued to resonate within the narrative of his decline. Allies who had once reinforced his power were now confronted with uncertainty, legal pressure, and the reconfiguration of alliances. The psychological frameworks that had sustained cohesion, mutual respect, shared risk, and strategic reinforcement, were tested under the weight of exposure and consequence. Gotti's ability to inspire and manage loyalty, even in the face of mounting legal pressure, reflects the enduring sophistication of his leadership, demonstrating how influence is maintained not merely through action but through the careful management of relationships, perception, and consequence. Reflection on Gotti's operational genius also provides insight into the mechanisms of organized crime at its highest levels. The orchestration of complex financial networks, the management of territories, and the careful integration of perception and psychology illustrate a systematic, disciplined approach to leadership. Each heist, assignment, and strategic move was part of a broader framework designed to maintain stability, maximize influence, and mitigate risk. Even in decline, the imprint of these methodologies remains evident, providing both a blueprint for operational management and a cautionary tale about the limits of power and the inevitability of scrutiny. The cultural fascination with Gotti further reinforces the duality of legacy. The public narrative often emphasized glamour, charisma, and the Teflon myth, occasionally overshadowing the operational realities and moral complexities of his life. Yet this fascination reflects enduring questions about power, morality, and human ambition. Why does society remain captivated by figures who navigate extreme circumstances with skill, audacity, and composure? How does the interplay of perception and reality shape our understanding of authority? Gotti's life invites contemplation of these themes, offering a lens through which to examine both individual psychology and collective fascination. The end of Gotti's public dominance was not simply a legal event but a transformation in the dynamics of influence and legacy. Conviction, incarceration, and the dismantling of operational controls signaled the end of one chapter, but the narrative surrounding him persisted, preserved in cultural memory, media representation, and the collective imagination. His ability to sustain loyalty, project authority, and navigate perception left an enduring imprint, illustrating the power of strategic intelligence, psychological insight, and disciplined leadership, even when practical control is curtailed. Legacy, in this context, extends beyond direct action into the realm of myth, influence, and memory. Gotti's story also highlights the interplay between human ambition and structural reality. His rise, dominance, and eventual decline demonstrate the delicate balance between strategic skill, operational control, and external pressure. No matter how meticulous, charismatic, or perceptive a leader may be, external forces, legal systems, rivals, and the constraints of mortality, introduce limits that cannot be entirely controlled. The narrative of his life provides a meditation on the nature of power, illustrating both its possibilities and its boundaries. Listeners are invited to trace the arc from youthful ambition to apex dominance, through scrutiny and eventual consequence, reflecting on both achievement and limitation. In contemplating the legacy of John Gotti, it is evident that his influence is multifaceted. Operationally, he demonstrated extraordinary skill in leadership, strategy, and psychological management. Socially, he cultivated loyalty, cohesion, and influence within complex networks of human behavior. Publicly, he projected charisma, composure, and myth, shaping perception as effectively as reality. His life is a study in the integration of action, perception, and psychological insight, illustrating how human ambition, skill, and charisma intersect with structural forces, risk, and consequence. Gotti's legacy, therefore, is not a simple narrative of crime or notoriety but a rich, layered exploration of power in its many forms. Ultimately, the story of John Gotti concludes with reflection, both for those who lived it and for those who study it from a distance. His life offers lessons in strategic intelligence, psychological acuity, operational skill, and the management of perception, all framed within the moral and ethical complexities of human action. While the legal consequences marked the end of his operational dominance, the enduring fascination with his persona, decisions, and methodology ensures that the narrative persists, inviting contemplation, analysis, and reflection. The life of the Teflon Don, Dapper Don, and legendary Gambino leader remains a testament to the intricacies of power, the resonance of myth, and the subtle, hypnotic interplay between perception and reality that defines human leadership at its most extreme.